sold my boss something.
Oh, okay, so I can see my screen. All right. Awesome.
Hopefully it won't reverb on it.
Hi, how are you?
Hello, good evening. I'm Paul.
Ali Modarres, how are you?
Nice to meet you.
Good to meet you as well.
I've sat through a number of your presentations.
Oh, good God, I'm so
because
sorry.
the PCRC and whatnot. Great. Hi.
How are you?
Well, good to see you again.
Ali Modarres. Okay.
Good evening. I'd like to call this meeting, the study session of Lakewood City Council for Monday, November 26th to order. I'm going to rearrange the agenda a little bit. And in spite of locking him out, we have Dr. Ali Modarres from University of Washington, Tacoma to give us the lowdown on thinking about sustainability.
Yeah.
Dr. Modarres.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be with you. I gave this talk in June, and I was asked for an encore performance, so I'm here to repeat that conversation. But I will do a little bit of an update since even those numbers. So basically, there's specific areas I will touch upon, which is the environment, economy, and equity, which is the definition of sustainability. But for this presentation, I'm going to be looking at the demography, jobs, transportation, and housing in this area particularly, and I will put it in the context of the region as a whole as we go through. If there are any questions, you can stop me instead of waiting until I get to the end. So here is a little bit of a rundown of the data for you. In order for me to do any analysis of a city the size of Lakewood, I have to take a look at the zip code areas, and for the zip codes, I have selected 5 of those that are at the bottom of the slides in your time. You can take a look at that. This data reflects 2017 with this estimated population for that. Those zip codes to stand about 70,000. The rate of growth for this region is about 6.8% over the 5-year period, which is a little bit about the same rate as the county. But before I came out this afternoon, I took a look at your data, the updated version of this data, and you're actually now into the 9% zone. So basically, that means the city of Lakewood is getting ahead of itself in terms of growth, because the projected level of, yes, what? These are by zip codes. These are the 5 zip codes, yes.
Mr. Branstetter.
Oh, God. Yeah.
By about 10%.
Yeah.
Do we have some zip codes that are not within the incorporated city?
Yes. Zip codes go outside the incorporated city.
So remember that when I look at zip codes, it does not look at the city jurisdiction. It goes a little bit over. So it's a little bit external to that, but it gives you the rate of the growth itself is what's important. What is interesting is that the job growth, so the projected growth over the next 5 years is expected based on the model I use at 6.5%, which is a little bit over 1.25% per year. But what you really are looking at is that if the pace of over the last year, it keeps going, it could be higher than that. In the 5 zip codes, and I'm just going to keep talking about that, the rate of job growth is a little bit slower than the population growth. And therefore, what really is going to happen here, and I'm keeping an eye on your median household income, and I will tell you why that is that the rate of growth as it happens is a little bit less than the population growth, but at the same time, the level of wages don't seem to be inching up too much, so I will go over some of that with you as well. In terms of your millennial population, we typically compare it to the nation as for areas about the same size. For city of Lakewood is 18,585. That number really doesn't matter in exactness of it. It's a little over 18,000, which is slightly larger in terms of its millennial population. All that means is that you have more of 30-something here than a region of this size would have had on average in the nation. And you have less retiring age population, which balances the same thing. So there's a little bit younger population, and also you don't have the sort of what's called a retirement problem of other cities that have, because the aging is happening in other cities. Good workforce. Comparison-wise, overall population is the share of the county is about 8.1%. In terms of jobs in the county is about 9.2%. So already that balance is there. We just don't want to lose it over time. And the level of contribution is a little bit higher than the population itself in terms of economy. Now here is where the data gets a little bit interesting. In terms of largest industries, outperforming national averages is only in governmental sector, and that's because of the base and because of the large presence of federal and state and, of course, local jobs. But after that, there are very few jobs, industry sectors in which these 5 zip codes outperform the national average. And the second one going down from that list is healthcare and social assistance, and then it's retail and accommodation and food. And I want you to keep track of that accommodation and food services, because that becomes an issue for us to think about in terms of equity, in terms of sustainability of the economy. In terms of industry location quotient, which is any industry that's over 1 is overrepresented, which means it's the strength of the region. In terms of the strength, again, governmental job. After that is arts, entertainment, and recreation. And the third sector is real estate and rental and leasing. So those are the 3 that are above location quotient of 1, which means those are the sort of things that would be outstanding. But retail trade is growing, which means it's going to exceed 1 in due time. In terms of growing industries, healthcare and social assistance is the fastest growing one, and I could just drive around Lakewood and tell you that without looking at the data. This is basically one sector that you should keep an eye on, because the wages in that sector are really important. And this is one sector in which we typically run into skill gap in this region. This is the one area in which we end up having the longest job postings, and in terms of our net commuters, there are more people coming into Pierce County to do that kind of job. And therefore, this is an area in which we can do well as a region. Your city does really well, but we need to make sure that there is the workforce for it. Accommodation and food services are growing as well. Following that is construction and others. So we go all the way through these, and you'll notice construction and retail and accommodations and food services constantly shows up in our charts. In terms of gross regional products, meaning contribution to the economy, again, that matches. Government is the big source of money in this area, and then it's healthcare and retail trade. Manufacturing is only the 4th area. So overall, there seems to be a consistency in terms of industry and in terms of contribution to the economy by those industries.
Sir, what's the source of the data?
So in the first one, if you look here, there's a private sector company which I rely on their data because they're nationally recognized for their data.
Same with the job information?
With the jobs, all of it, I try to use the single source. The dilemma with Census Bureau and using sometimes state data is that it's a couple of years late. Bureau of Labor Statistics is a year and a half late. But if we go by economic modeling and those who provide that sort of data, you can get more recent data that way. In terms of earning, this region, every time you do an analysis of earnings, utilities always is on the top. And that makes sense. This is typical for regions where utility is strong. And after that is finance and government and wholesale trade and so on. But the wages drop rather quickly. And that essentially means that as we begin to take a look at the areas in which we have growth, notice they move to the bottom of the chart. Now, arts, entertainment, and recreation, accommodation, food services, which they were growing fast, they fall in the lower income category, which means it affects overall median household income and wages, which will have an impact on purchasing power of the population, which means in due time, the affordability of housing becomes a challenge as well for those who are residing
Mr.
here.
Simpson.
Doctor, I got a question educational services rank so low when you consider we've got 2 colleges in this area and a number of high schools, all of which are relatively above the national median or average in pay?
This does not include educators in there. These are the service providers within the education sector.
Good. All right. I see the distinction. Okay.
Yeah, they go on the government.
So teachers, instructors, college administrators.
They are in the government. Yep.
Okay. The state government.
Because who pays their paycheck, that becomes. But that service provider, those service providers are the ones that are in that industry and that could be contracted to do that kind of work.
So in Western State.
So the largest employment gains between 2012 and 2017 have been in these following industries. I just brought them up. And gradually, proportionally, the proportion of government sector is declining over time, which is a good indicator, which means other professions are coming up and other industries are coming up to fill up the overall number of jobs. In terms of business size, 53% of businesses have a 1 to 4 employee, which means this is a region that primarily small firms are in operation. 1 out of 5 roughly are employing 5 to 9 employees, and only 1% of businesses have more than 100 employees. Remember, this is percentage in terms of number of work sites, not in terms of the size of the employment. In terms of largest occupations, of course, now it shows up, military shows up as the top. And if you look at the gray, for an area of this size, look at how much this region outperforms other regions. So it's largely a military presence that shows up. And in food preparation and service-related services also, it's a little bit above the national average in that sense. So there is a kind of a logic to this, because as you begin to have military services and other type of work, you're going to have retail and food services and other kind of functions coming in. But there is something else to watch here. And that is, as the millennial population begins to occupy, to live here, but does not work here, they're going to need services like food and that sort of stuff. But as one friend one time said, we can't serve coffee to each other for the rest of our lives. We need other kinds of jobs as well. So in some ways, what that essentially means is that we need to keep track of those wage issues as time goes by. The top growing occupations are also, again, in food services and construction. And I have not done that analysis, but I can tell you a couple of years ago when I did an analysis of the unemployment patterns in this region, it seemed like a source of unemployment numbers remaining a little bit higher than the national average or the state average has to do with construction and food and retail. So those seem to be more seasonal and varying over time, so they contribute to unemployment rates. And I have a chart for you so you can see, but you can see construction is one of the major categories in January of 2018 when I looked at the data for unemployment rates. In terms of earning, of course, management, legal, architectural, healthcare, and so on are the highest. And those services which we are growing in this region and perhaps in these 5 zip codes that are at the bottom, they tend to have lower wages. That is going to really talk to the fact that who is buying the services and how we're going to create more jobs in the middle categories and higher to be able to afford those service sector jobs.
As you've been watching that statistic, when there have been minimum wage increases at the bottom, have those gotten mirrored all the way to the chart to keep the difference between the bottom and the top?
I have not done it, yeah. I have not done a detailed study of it, but I know that when the minimum wage is being touched, it does not necessarily ripple all the way to the top. What ripples to the top is regional competition. So so there's a logic to commuting. I'm going to get to that one, so let me get ahead of myself for a second. If there are jobs in professional categories in King County and Pierce County, and the King County one is 20% more, we can logically say that the cost of living in this region is lower, therefore, hence, the payment to the professionals is lower. But to a 30-year-old who is looking at 20% more income in King County, the last thing they think about is their health. The first thing they think about is how much that 20% is going to contribute to their family's well-being, and therefore, they're going to take on to themselves to do the commute. So what we really should be looking at is not so much how the increasing minimum wage ripples up, but when we come to the higher categories of jobs, begin to think about the regional wage differentials and how much of that wage differential can be corrected. So there is this sort of a focus on above $25 an hour sort of wages as well, because that is where we lose people if we don't keep an eye on it. So onto that topic, on that cue, if I looked at this boundary of roughly the area of Lakewood, you do attract people to come here, about 20,000 worth of them or more. And this data is old because only Census Bureau has that data. So that goes to 2015 or 16, I can't quite recall right now. But what you have is about 16,000 people who live in the city actually leave every morning to go work somewhere else. And about 20,000 people come to work here, and only about 3,000 people live and work here. Which essentially means that even in terms of services, we could be looking at the importing population into Lakewood to provide service jobs or retail jobs. Because now from our data, we know that even those who work in the retail sector that they don't pay a lot, they go cross-region for jobs that are more steady or jobs that are now available as opposed to waiting for jobs that are in their own region. And in terms of outbounds and inbounds, the high outbound area tends to be the eastern portion of Lakewood, and the inbound and the inbound is on the eastern side, and the western side is where people leave to go to other regions. So it's sort of a split, and it makes sense because if you're going to work in Lakewood, you're going to come to areas closer to the freeway. Now, who are the outflow commuters? And for your city, I have looked at it closely to see who are the people who leave. I can't tell you for other cities. It's just for this area. About 1/4 are 29 years old or younger. More than half of them are 30 to 54. Service workers are the largest group of commuters, and they typically have higher incomes to the counterparts of their own occupation in the city. In other words, they leave this area because they can make more money. And about 17% of them commute more than 25 miles for more money. And here is one reason perhaps for it. I put this map in there to ask you to keep an analysis of this data for your city, whoever can do that analysis for you. You always want to keep a map of your neighborhoods of median multiples, and the way median multiples is defined is looking at median housing value divided by median household income of that neighborhood. And that multiplier should not exceed 4. By the time you get to 5, things get pretty bad, which means the affordability of the housing is not there. Now, it doesn't mean that the person who are living in that house bought the house at that level. It means that if they leave their house, they couldn't buy their own house with the income. Bank would not qualify them. So this map is essentially to suggest that perhaps cities in this region, as we are getting more population coming from north to south, that we want to keep an eye on the housing value so our local residents do not end up feeling themselves outbidded out of the housing market.
The lakes skew that.
So in terms of moving forward, a couple of suggestions. If anything, commuting and housing show that we live in a region and not a single city. And the only reason I'm bringing this up is that when a worker in Lakewood looks at a job in Kent and says, I want that job because it pays more, is because they see the whole place as one region. They don't see it as, traveling. They're not migrants. They're workers that are looking 20, 25 miles north to do the job. So they see themselves in a region. Perhaps we want to think about it. In terms of millennial population, this county and this city are going to see more of the millennials. As we grow, even nationally, we're going to attract millennials. Now, why do I say act accordingly? Is because when millennials come here, they're typically in their 30s, and they're at the early stages of family formation, so they have a family orientation. They want to live in regions that are child and youth focused, so their children at least have those resources available to them. They typically tend to be more thinking about sustainability issues, so they look at walkability, they look at integrated neighborhoods. Parks and entertainments is really important for them. Quality of schools is really important for them. And here's the one part that I looked at the housing permits for this region, and we need to keep an eye on that one, that millennials have a taste for diversity of housing types, meaning that they're not just looking for single detached homes. They are looking for condos, or it's okay for them for start a family. What they really seem to respond to positively are small townhouses. And the one thing that we know is that on average, millennials nationally are looking at houses that are smaller than their parents' houses. So they're looking at things that are no more than 2,000, 2,500 square feet. They're not looking at those monster houses of the past of 4,000 square feet and things like we grew up in. Yes.
Are these in order, in any particular
No.
order?
These are the sort of,
Doesn't...
no, this is not a part, this is just the package they're looking for. So when we look at millennial movement, we are seeing now a little bit different behavior. In 20-something, the same population sought inner cities, the city cores, for their livelihood, for the kind of life they provided, for the resume building functions, for accumulating cash in order for them to do something with it. As soon as they get married, they begin to think about it, but not so much. But arrival of the first child is when they begin to move.
So I've heard something similar from folks in the real estate industry, that it's not as much a change in the desires of the age group, but a delay, some because of the economy, some because of later marriages, et cetera. Is that what you've found? Or?
Yeah, it's exactly, it's the delay process. It's the same people who at one point wanted one kind of lifestyle, and now they're looking for the other one. The second thing that they look for is that regardless of how much they worked in the central part of the city, buying their first housing at above $500,000 is not something that's an option for them. And we know there's only one thing we know about the behavior of commuting from decades of research, is that when an individual starts moving out to look for housing, there is a threshold that they arrive. And that threshold in every region is different and is by miles. In some, let's assume a number. 20 miles, they're gonna search. We know that threshold, once they pass, they will go significantly more for better housing. Because once they pass that level, they don't view the extra 5 miles as a challenge. They now look for better housing for their money and better quality of life for their family. So as I look at this region, basically as we get to this area about, is where we have passed the threshold. So this is the sort of areas, if you were working in downtown Seattle and commuting from here, you're looking at a significant amount of time between here and Seattle. And so the quality of housing is quite important for them as time goes by. There is an art to placemaking, and they really like that. What they like in their youth, they like it repeated, closer to their townhouses, which is you already have, food and entertainment and all that sort of stuff that goes with it. But the quality of life at the same time is that for them, if they don't have it, they will go to a neighboring city to get it. So one way that I have talked about for a couple of years is that I think no one city can provide everything, but cities can get together and provide it together. So that's one issue. We need to think about additional growth centers in this region. I honestly think we can't just live on millennials. We need to begin to think about how we create very small number of high employment centers in this region. I ask cities to not ask me where they're going to be. I ask cities to talk to each other and figure out where are the ideal places for these employment centers. And I know there is an argument between here and PSRC around those issues. I've been to enough PCRC meetings to hear that sort of stuff. But it is important for us that, not necessarily formally, but to begin to think about what are some of the growth centers that we can look at to localize our investment and our keeping our population here to work and generate economies locally. This requires a regional multi-sector involvement. I have said that multiple times, that we as a university are happy to help with that as well, however we can. But in terms of partnership, I think cities need to be working together. We can bring our collective expertise to begin to imagine a region that's a little bit different and begin to think of our region not to lose its quality, but add to it, as opposed to modifying it into something that was built 25 miles, 30 miles north of here. I don't think anybody is looking for that. We just want our own region to be very
Mr. Brandstetter.
bright and different.
As you talk about creating additional growth centers, city or as a consortium of cities, what are the seeds?
Of that. So you need to look at your transportation system the way you have it. So actually what makes sense for example, in transit systems that you have. The second thing is that already some of these locations are emerging. I have done an analysis of employment density for this region, and I would be happy to share with you. Already I can see the budding notions of places where these employment centers are emerging in an ad hoc way. In other words, they were not planned. It's just that concentration of employment is kind of creating those things. For example, just close to us in Tacoma, because of the hospitals and because of the university, certainly there is this now concentration of employment in one location. But also you have that in 5 Port area, and you have in Puyallup and a couple other places. It is for us for this region, not me, for this region to begin to think about what are the 3, 4 places that are fed by transit or that can be concentrated, some sort of transportation system can be put into place to feed these employment centers so they can become the kind of active centers so down the road they would be recognized. The one thing that I want to mention here is that data always is looking past, looking into what has happened. For employment centers, you can look a little bit to what has happened, but you have to project a vision forward in order for you to be able to do that. And that can only be achieved through collaboration, not competition. In other words, cities need to talk to each other to decide where are the ideal places to be put. I can tell you that more and more companies, and that's my last bullet, more and more companies are looking at regions that are sustainable in order for them to move it because they think their employees want that. And so we need to sort of begin to think about a region that doesn't need to have high rises, but is built sustainably in a way that attracts the new economy to it.
So the political question, which I don't know that you have an answer for, but we'll ask it anyway because we're searching, is, you know, the irony is that the Puget Sound Regional Council as a transportation funding source was created in large part to facilitate transportation.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the goals was to keep people working where they're living, so you need less transportation to accommodate them. Yet what is developed is this interregion competitiveness where Pierce County, Kitsap County to a certain extent too, can't compete for center designations successfully because King County has the votes and they want the transportation money. How do we address this without someone in Olympia cramming it down their throat?
You know, the solution, MPOs, Metropolitan Planning Organizations, are exactly that. It doesn't matter where they are, that's their function that they play. I don't think there's so much about not wanting an employment center. It's about how you feed it. And what I'm suggesting is different than the employment centers in the way that an MPO would put out in terms of suggestions. An employment center that I'm talking about is a kind of a systematic 10-year plan for this region to begin to talk amongst the cities. Where are the locations where we have the right kind of land use, we have the right kind of permitting, we have the right kind of relationship that we could begin to concentrate. And in terms of even site location, that becomes our primary offering to the outside area in terms of locating new businesses. You can't create employment center without them being formally considered that. Now, the reason I said we look back in history, if you create it over the next 10 years, when the new assessment is done in 10 years, then the employment center would show up on the map. Right now, I have to stretch the data on my end to see employment densities in Pierce County. So even with the absence of PSRC, finding those concentrations, I can find a few nodes, but I cannot find them in the way that even if I just didn't look at PSRC map and looked at just purely employment density of King County, I can quickly find them, right? So I think this issue, it is political, but the stages of getting to the political narrative, I think comes through the collaboration of the Pierce County folks. I have talked with PSRC, and I don't think they would be objecting to a vision that this region generates and works on, not necessarily as a formal plan, but as a staging process for the next phase. Otherwise, we'll be here 10 years from now debating the same PSRC approach to where the employment centers are, and I don't know where we would be with that, short of increasing seats at PSRC to vote differently, you know what I mean? So that's a political strategy that's different than what I'm talking about. Yes.
Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Well, stepping back from the Sisyphean task that you just left us with, and moving a little more to the micro. And by the way, I really appreciate the way you presented the data. I think you've done an excellent job.
Thank you.
Now, let's look at that data as a pile of lumber.
Okay.
Right? Take anything away from your work. If we were to construct a plan for the city, say our comprehensive improvement plan for the next 10 to 20 years, could we do so that would allow us to compare what you have here to what we have now?
So you mean if you repeat that one, because I lost it somewhere. I thought you were projecting to the future.
I'm not that smart. Could we take the data that you have presented to us and construct a model? And then use that model in comparison, or in order to compare to what we have in our minds planned for the city of Lakewood?
Yes, that can be done.
Now, how hard a task, because you used the word analysis once in your presentation, how hard a task would that be?
It takes a little bit of time, but it's doable. I mean, this would take another researcher and me to get together and begin to think about how to model that one, because this is something that the only thing that I have to tell you is that modeling that we would be doing is based on the data that we have, on this data, and I don't know what data you use to do your planning. So,
well, as I listened to the presentation, and I caught what you said, Jason, much of what you've said we've covered. And I had a sense that we are on the right track here, but in order to get another bearing, another spot from which to navigate, that's what gave me the idea as to a second analysis. In other words, we've done ours, and much of what you said we are tracking. Even the mayor's question to you a moment ago should give you a sense of just where we are in this bigger scheme of things, let alone what we're doing here in the city. But I'm just curious as to we could isolate, focus down more with a second model.
yes, that could be done, but the thing that I would encourage you to sort of think about, if that's the approach you want to take, is to also put Lakewood in the context of the region. In other words, think of it as a regional plan, as opposed to just Lakewood itself. You know, also there are things that the region can do together. I think for the last 18 months or so, we have been meeting with folks from different cities and different jurisdictions and different offices around the notions of a South Sound group, which is our South Sound Alliance. So I think there is a way to begin to elevate to the next level, to begin to think about what would be the region's economic development model to go forward. But there's so much that is also you can do that the model cannot predict.
Yes. Yeah.
For example, if you were to improve transit in a particular way, what would be the outcome of the process? You know, sort of how would that function? If you reduce traffic because you created transportation management systems, then what would be the actual outcome of the economic model in which you would try to turn things around? If instead of job searching or job hunting, you know, we do in economic development, we try to bring companies. What if regions did skill recruitment instead of company recruitment? Those are the sort of things that the new ways of thinking we can think about. We know there's going to be people coming to Pierce County. What if we targeted them toward the industries that we want to grow? In other words, there was a recruitment strategy that brought us the people who we don't have. In terms of pipeline, we are great. We have the universities, we have the community colleges, all that sort of is great. But if the 200,000 people, let's say, I'm just gonna make up a number in my head, coming over the next 20, 30 years to this county, why can't at least half of it be targeted in the way that feeds the industries that we want to grow? So to the point of creating retroactively, because in 2030, anything between now and 2030 would be retroactive. We would have actually built that infrastructure for these employment areas to emerge.
So have you looked at this in, I think before I heard you speak on sales tax dependency and some of these lower return type of locations. How does that fit into that dynamic?
So regions that don't have a kind of sort of a diversity of economic sectors, so in other words, they don't have multiplicities. And if it's just housing, they're going to attract service. A lot of local services will still be needed. Groceries will be needed. Retail will be, all sorts of retail will be needed. The challenge of that is that you end up creating a sector that is largely dependent on purchasing power of others. So there are a couple of ways cities end up doing that. Either they create, and we've seen it over time, either they create a mall or an outlet mall or something to feed that retail thirst of the area, or they're going to create fragmented storefront services. So that's one area in which that creates, but that can cater in two ways. One is to the population that comes in to live there for weekends and nights, and the rest of the time is out, and the rest of the family is enjoying the services. Or services like the like of which we see in major employment centers, which cater during daytime to the employees. And those function differently, and they have a higher return on their monies, and the cities are organized differently. So service sector is a needed sector regardless of what direction a city goes. What added value there is that if the service industry is the added industry, is the cherry on the top, then it's great. But if the services industry is it, in and itself, there isn't an industry in which they're only catering to residents, then the equation doesn't work as well.
Mr. Whalen.
Well, I appreciate the information. I've had the opportunity and the privilege to hear you speak a little bit. I'm on PCRC. On occasion, I get to trek north to PSRC, and I'm on the Economic Development Board here in Tacoma, Pierce County. So, you know, my fear is just a business owner, lawyer, council member kind of guy, is that we have tended to take a shotgun approach to trying to do this economic development pie. And, you know, as you well know, good data drives better public policy.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts about, in the development of a regional economic model or development model, what do you think truly are the comparative advantages for the South Sound that we should trumpet and rally around as a regional body to try to take advantage of these trends, right?
Yeah,
and what gaps do you think we have? I mean, honest gaps.
Honest gaps.
Honest gaps and honest comparative advantages.
I think the comparative advantage is that you have the labor, you just don't have the jobs for it. Mm-hmm. So in other words, you have an audience here that has come to you for whatever reason, and for somebody who has been a long commuter most of his life, I can tell you there comes a time it gets really old, and you just want to get out of it. But the options can't be something like, I'm going to take a 40% pay cut to do and go into another industry.
Because I can get a cheap house. That can't be the only reason.
Exactly. So I think one of the first things that I would recommend for this region, and as I have said in our meetings of South Sound Alliance, we can do that, is to do an in-depth analysis of the existing skill sets here. Mm-hmm. Then begin to think about both vision and what is possible. Vision is to say, well, we want another Microsoft. Honestly, I'm not sure. I think mimicking others is not very becoming for a region. So what we really want to begin to think about is the skill set that we have and the kind of industries we're looking at. Does that quite match in what we are doing? If University X, and I'm referring to myself, to our university, is producing this many computer programmers every year, but there are no local absorption of them, well, we're going to net export the kids. So I think that the idea is that to stop the leakage. So I would focus on the skill because it's both an asset and also a challenge because every morning we lose them northward, right? The other part of it that we can begin to think about, instead of looking at every industry who is willing to come here, we hand them a key, since you asked honest. Mm-hmm. But we need to begin to say and I asked that question 2 weeks after I arrived in this region. what are your top 3 industries that you think in 10 years everybody in the country would know you for it? And I'm still to hear that answer, what they are, even no data included.
What do you think they are, based on what you've heard?
I honestly think this region has a the medical profession, but it hasn't created the allied medical professions. There was a time that this region could have become a major health data center of the country, and we didn't really go to health analytics in the way that we could have gone, because the tech industry doesn't come in one variety. The health tech is important because as the population of this country ages, I mean, you know that the United States is aging. There's nothing that can stop it. It's just, we have now are on that trend. We're gonna need more healthcare. We're gonna need more of that. If we end up in this region with a large retired population, which I don't think is happening right away in every place, but in certain locations, there are industries allied to that, which is related to health that we're gonna need. So the health industry is that. It's fundamentally important, but everything around it. So in other words, every subcontract that you can think of that goes with the health industry would be a way to think about the future of this region. Lakewood has it, Tacoma has it, and it doesn't matter what city I pull up, it looks like that industry is moving naturally to the top, except that we need to sort of talk about it as a purposeful growth as opposed to something that's happening to us. The other part of it that's really important, and this is the last bullet, this region has an asset that has to advertise on megaphones, and that is, this is a region with not only with natural settings, but it has been created, not perhaps planned, as a family-friendly and youth-friendly region. We need to sort of capitalize on that. Moving forward, if we do not do that, then the region will not be family-friendly and youth-friendly, because then we are not gonna keep up with the 30-something and their families who are coming here. Aging in place is really important. So if you want the 30-plus to stay here, you need to think about them not when they're 30, but then when they're 40, when they're 50, and then when their parents come. I'm astonished to find out how many people have moved to this region because their kids work here. They retired to this region because of their children, right? I've seen them from here all the way up to Kitsap. I mean, this is not even a single place event. We have a significant number of 55 plus in this region who are highly skilled and they retired too early. They need to be absorbed into the market once again. Nobody wants to sit at home at 60 years of age. I'm 61. If you tell me to stay home, that would be really sad. So basically, this is a region with a whole bunch of skills and a whole bunch of assets that are below it. And it can operationalize on that one, but every now and then the plan, I'm saying it in an honest way, every now and then the plan seems to be wanting something we don't have as opposed to something that we have.
So 2 follow-ups, if I may, on that. On the workforce issue, this is an issue that comes up all the time. I was with the EDB in Farnborough, England this summer, and we were there on behalf of the Boeing supply chain to try to, re-engage the talks with folks who might come to the area with intent to supply and facilitate the Boeing contracts. Workforce is the #1 question. So I throw it back to you. We've got fine educational institutions in the South Sound. Are they getting ahead of the curve and forecasting what they perceive to be the jobs of the future to ensure that their programs today are going to help us in the South Sound meet the demand of the future?
Yes, in some ways, this is absolutely what's happening. We see biomed now highly growing in our programs, and I think this region also will end up with other sectors that are related to biotech and biomed. So those are the areas where our university will be looking at it. However, I do want to encourage you to think of it in a different way as well. It is important to also think about, I'm going to go back to skill recruitment, that in areas in which university supply cannot meet the fast demand, if you're doing really well and you have biomed growing really fast and we can't supply it, that's exactly the way we should be recruiting population to this region. One of the ways that this can be done is Pierce County-based actually job announcement websites, which we've been talking about in our meetings, about the notion of scrubbing every year the data that is available regionally and making it available to the entire country to see what we have here to offer. So where we are short, we can actually attract people purposefully. So somebody sitting in LA commuting 2.5 hours like I used to do can actually look at that and say, you know what, that 10% difference, I am happy to take a cut and go on. So those are the sort of things that I think we shouldn't just locally produce, locally consume when it comes to skill. We need to utilize the skill, but when we are short, we need the double side of it. The university supplying it and then actually purposefully recruiting.
In terms of the advantage you talked about of the South Sound, the family-friendly, youth-friendly, you felt that the area generally is. What are the top 3 attributes of those components that either need to be expanded upon or?
I think your speakers are here to talk about that.
Yeah.
I think one of the areas in which this region has a challenge and needs to do more or work on that challenge is that there are very few metropolitan areas with one single freeway. And transit is fundamental.
We're going to fill the Sound or the lakes?
Well, all of that will work. So I think one of the attributes is that that's a region that's very attractive, and it also sort of the environment, the natural setting is really good, but the natural setting also has dictated specific infrastructure development that works against it. Yeah. I cannot begin to tell you how often I actually push away the thoughts about earthquake in this region. Because if I-5 was to collapse, I don't know what would become of the economy of this region in the 2 or 3 weeks that it would take to rebuild that freeway and get it to the right place. So there are things that our environment provides us that attracts people here, that people see it and they want to be here. We have a very good set of not only natural settings, but the way this region has been put together is quite attractive. But at the same time, the runaway train of it is that if the sprawl begins to go too far out and we begin to not have transit services and we don't think about transportation, we don't worry about east-west commutes that are happening, and it's not the Lakewood issue, we eventually going to tangle ourselves up. And 167 is not going to answer that question either. So I just want to make sure that everywhere I go to say, transportation perhaps is the top challenge of this region, and that's why they're
Did they pay you to say that as a segue? Yeah.
So you commuted 2.5 hours in Southern California. What are you commuting now?
My commute is 10 miles now. It's absolutely nothing. Actually, just to tell you is that when I got here, I didn't know what to do with the extra time. It was really a gift. Yeah.
Mr. Branstetter.
How important or how much energy should the southern South Sound spend in setting itself apart in terms of image and other things from Seattle?
I think the energy should be spent in creating a vision for this region. I don't think this is not a warfare of any sort. We are talking about a single region anyway. But South Sound needs to be able to provide its own trajectory and vision of where it wants to go. Without it, there will be always central planning. Central planning is the easiest way to do things, and that's why MPOs, that's how they function. They look at the data in the past, they accumulate it to the current, and project it out. For this region to create a vision of itself, it needs more of a micro data, begin to understand the nature of every city, how University Place is different from Puyallup, Puyallup is different from Lakewood, Lakewood is different from, and just begin to understand the difference, but at the same time begin to think about a collective vision. It is important for South Sound to have a unique character of its own, that so when you talk about plans, that character and that vision is driving everything else in it. So I've seen South Sound a different character already. It is a different kind of region. It just needs to begin to play on that. But if it's not heretical, I would tell you that this South Sound extends all the way to Olympia. It's not just, doesn't stop in DuPont. It goes further south. And so in some ways, South Sound has to be reimagined, repackaged, and rethought in a different way than a single county or small group of cities.
Any other questions? Oh. Well, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
Most informative, and next time we'll unlock the door for you.
Okay, all right, thank you very much.
Sure, we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
We now have this Sound Transit presentation with Mr. Peter Rogoff, CEO. I see he's brought his.
Well, good evening, and first let me, I guess I can be heard pretty well here. First, apologize for my late arrival. As you all know as well as anyone, one bad accident on I-5 in the rain can impact your commute by at least 30 minutes. So, whereas we were on track to get here at 6:45, I think we got here more closer to 7:20. I appreciate your indulgence in letting me arrive late. I actually do think it's appropriate that I have the opportunity to talk to you about Sound Transit's plans for the South Sound coming after Professor Modarres' observations about what the future portends for the region. I've heard his presentations before, and I think they're, in terms of changing demographics in the regional economy and sustainability and what young employees are looking for, I think that's all appropriate to my discussion here this afternoon. Let me also, while he's here, thank John Caulfield. I spent the Wednesday before Thanksgiving talking to the city managers for Pierce County. Unfortunately, our regular Sound Transit Board meetings go opposite precisely their meeting. So they did a special off-cycle meeting so I could address them for a second time. So it's good to see you, Mary. We are very grateful to the city of Lakewood for the lend of Mary Moss during her tenure as a Sound Transit Board member. What I was going to do is both talk about our investments planned in the South Sound, but also we've often found that we sort of make expectations about that people already know what we're already doing, and I think actually it's worth taking a few minutes to talk about what the Sound Transit network looks like today, because it's actually, in terms of ridership and activity, it's quite a bit different than it just was a couple of years ago. So I will start off there. Firstly, importantly, we are building out the largest transit expansion program in the United States. We are sometimes compared to Los Angeles, but when you add the ST3 investments together with the ones the voters already approved in Sound Move and ST2, we are actually a larger transit program than is currently being expanded in Los Angeles. The vision is to complete 116 miles of light rail across all 3 counties, connecting 16 cities, where at its peak we'll have 4-car trains arriving every 4 minutes in the busiest corridors during the peak periods. We will also have 91 miles of Sounder commuter rail, which has been one of our fastest growing services when you don't include expansions of service, and 45 miles of bus rapid transit, which is a service that we are just beginning for the first time in the region, 405 and 522 being the largest that we'll be doing. But as far as current service, we currently run 13 Sounder South trips each weekday to 5 stations. That's 9,200 weekday boardings. I think importantly, we just happen to be looking at the numbers for Lakewood. Sounder boardings in Lakewood, compared to where we started in 2012, is up some 350%. But I think most notably, Sounder boardings in Lakewood are up 75% just in the last 2 years. 57% of all of the Sounder South boardings come from Pierce County, and Pierce County has more Sounder stops than either King or Snohomish. Separately from that, our Tacoma Link service serves about another 3,000 boardings per weekday. And importantly, bus service is still an absolute critical part and kind of a workhorse of our system. We have 8 Sound Transit Express routes serving Pierce County for another 10,000 riders per weekday. Those are operated largely by Pierce Transit for us, and we pay them a fee to do that. In fact, Pierce Transit, just because of its cost effectiveness, is also running some of our bus service in King County. I was interesting to hear the conversation about the workforce and the needs of the workforce. 25% of the workforce that works on Sound Transit projects region-wide comes from Pierce County, and just since 2014, Pierce County residents have brought in about $50 million in wages from Sound Transit projects, and we expect that to only increase. In fact, To the professor's point, we are looking at labor shortages in a number of skilled crafts, and we are aggressively partnering with Pierce County community colleges and the labor organizations down here in Pierce County to grow that workforce. Part of the overall effort to convince everyone that not everyone coming out of high school should go to college, and there's some very promising crafts where we can not only, with a 25-year capital plan endorsed by the voters, train them into positions in Pierce County and keep them at work on projects in Pierce County for the next 23 years at a minimum. So we have actually had to step up this effort, and the board's committed about $850,000 a year just in the area of job training. Normally we just could have let the market provide us with what we needed. That is no longer a reality in the construction trades, especially in the very hot construction market that we're in. We have certain projects where literally skilled craft people are being flown in from Nebraska to work on our projects and flown back at the contractor's expense. We actually just hosted one of these events at Evergreen State College here in Tacoma, where we partnered up contractors with youth that were interested in pursuing those fields, and 2 of those youth have already been tapped into apprenticeship programs and hired by 2 of our contractors already, and that was just a couple of weeks ago. So we're very encouraged on that. Other projects in the South Sound, these are called access projects, but by and large they are expansions of parking. We've all heard about the concerns about inadequate parking, and frankly we will never be able to build enough parking to serve all of the folks who want to gravitate to our rail services or even our bus services. But we do have 4 separate projects. You can see them all identified there along Sounder stops for about 2,000 additional parking spaces, while we also work with Pierce Transit and others to be able to connect people to Sounder. Other areas that we are looking at, this is a big issue that we're going to be kicking off next year. As I said, Sounder service, in terms of just the same number of trains, is growing faster than almost any other service. Obviously, we've had dramatic growth in light rail ridership, but that also came with an expansion of the light rail network. When you're talking about just, status quo Sounder service, we continue to grow passengers year after year. We have a very large increment of dollars in the range of $1 billion set aside to do a number of things with Sounder South to expand its capacity. One of the things that we will be doing almost certainly is going from 7-car trains to 10-car trains and making the necessary changes to platforms to facilitate that. Why do we emphasize that first? Whenever we're talking about increasing the number of Sounder South frequencies, which we also want to do, it involves a very lengthy and somewhat expensive negotiation with Burlington Northern Santa Fe to make sure that we make capital improvements to their railroad so that we continue to deconflict freight movements with passenger movements. That's very important in terms of maintaining employment and not endangering the opportunity for growth at places like the Port of Tacoma and Port of Seattle. But also we have to pay to operate over their railroad. But just moving from 7-car trains to 10-car trains gives me the opportunity to boost capacity by about 35%, and I don't have to negotiate that with BNSF. I can run as long a train as I can run to serve the South Sound. So that's sort of one of the lowest hanging fruit in terms of building Sounder South capacity. But we will also enter into negotiations. We're sort of developing a strategic plan that will be kicked off by the board very soon, early in 2019, getting a strategic plan to figure out what is the right mix of frequency improvements, capacity improvements, platform expansions, and all of those things to make the optimal Sounder South investments to best serve what are growing communities, and frankly, communities along Sounder South with all of the population growth that we expect. When you look at what population growth is expected in cities like Puyallup, Sumner, here in Lakewood, it actually exceeds the expected growth of the region. Go ahead, feel free.
Question. With regard to the daily trips and the negotiation, is there much thought in a possible even one trip a weekend service in addition to the special stuff for games? Because I hear that constantly.
As do we.
Yeah.
We sort of want to bring everything onto the table. I mean, we've heard a lot about midday service, about how more people, if they knew they could get home midday, if their kid was suddenly taken sick at school. Right. There's a strong interest in people who would like to not just go home right after work, but would like to be able to do social events. I would like to see more reverse commutes where we can, which is to say, Executive Dammeier has been very articulate about wanting to grow jobs here and not just have everyone coming north to go south. Well, we also want to provide access for people to travel south. Sure. All of that requires a negotiation. Specifically on weekends, BNSF maintains that they do a lot of their freight movements over the weekend because of the restrictions, because of passenger service during the week. I think everything's on the table. I think we just need to find out, you know, they are continuing to expect growth in port traffic. And we will, you know, they get the benefit of us applying for the environmental permits to do that work on their railroad, but we also have the benefit of the challenge of having to pay for it, even though it's improvements to their railroad. So we will be consulting with all of the cities along the Sounder alignment as we go through this. We're just at the beginning stages, but please know that there's very large investments to be made. My biggest concern is that Sounder South traffic may grow faster than I can procure rail cars. And we already have on some trains standees on those rail cars. So I need to get to those, at least those 10-car trains as soon as I can get there. I think, as you know, toward the latter years of the plan, we're also expanding, and Lakewood will no longer be our terminus stop, but instead we will be extending on to Tillicum and DuPont. You know, when we talk about the opportunities for planning for new communities, sort of visioning with the city leaders in Tillicum about how they want the introduction of Sounder to help grow their community. We know that the population is coming. Is a really great opportunity. This is an investment, quite frankly, that I think you could support today. I've met with the base commander at JBLM, and in terms of the challenge that they have, especially for military spouses that are commuting to work. You know, when you look at the kind of traffic that we're seeing around JBLM now, you know, when you think about 2025, you know, into the 2030s, that's one of the things that is, we don't talk about it much, but is also just a depressing reality that we're facing in all three counties. We talk about, at least, you know, these investments will not necessarily make congestion decrease. With 1 million more people coming to the region by 2040, the question is, how bad is it going to get? And by giving people a choice of having alternative means to travel, it will not get as bad. But the reality is before we can get all these projects built, it's going to get worse than it is today. And what I experienced coming down here just this evening could have been 20 minutes worse 5 years from now. So all the more important that we are able to stay on track to get these investments done as soon as possible. On light rail, our first step is to get to Federal Way so we can continue on to Tacoma. And unlike the trip to the north, where we are scheduled to get up to Linwood in 2024, but then would not initiate construction to go farther north to Everett until later in the plan. In terms of getting south, we are committed to delivering to Tacoma by 2030, but we have to get to Federal Way first. So this project is very well along. We are entering the engineering phase with the Federal Transit Administration to get to Federal Way, to get from Angle Lake through Kent, Des Moines, South 272nd down to the Federal Way Transit Center. That project is already planned, under design. We have baselined it at $2.45 billion, and we see no reason to, and we just had checked in with our vendors and are still very optimistic of delivering it at that funding level. It will come with additional parking as well, and that will open in 2024. But 1 year after that, we will just continue. You'll see 1 year after opening that, we will break ground. So we are already doing the planning and development for the Tacoma Dome extension. There already is a stakeholder group and an elected leadership group of people planning the alignment for this project. It is a challenging one in that we have a very narrow corridor to get through, to get to Fife and East Tacoma to get to Tacoma Dome. We will also cross Puyallup tribal lands, and we'll actually touch tribal lands in several spots, not just in the main section of the reservation, but also down into tribal lands in the city. And that enters into its own challenges just in terms of securing property. There are some pieces of property that we are not allowed to own, but may want to get a very long-term lease in order to be able to run transit over it. So that is already in development. So when we get started moving south on the Federal Way, we will just keep working and should have contractors on board to break ground 1 year after Federal Way opens to get down to Tacoma in 2030.
So after that, there's one political compromise that was making, just tell me there's no hope so I never think of it again. The second Tacoma link extension that wanders through West Tacoma out toward University Place. Is there any chance that those assets would be redirected to further extend the spine of the system as opposed to wandering through those neighborhoods that don't have commuters?
Are you talking about the extension to Tacoma Community College?
Yeah,
okay.
The second phase that was generally recognized here as a political compromise, but it doesn't further the idea of creating a light rail spine through the South Sound area, and it services very little in the way of present need for commuter traffic.
Well, I'll be honest, what I've heard most from is just because of meetings I've been in, I've encountered a lot of Tacoma Community College students who are very distraught over the fact that it will take us so long to get there. But to answer your question,
they can get there on a bus today. I'm on the Pierce Transit board, and you can get very inexpensive bus transportation that has a major station right at the university. So the transportation's there. I know it's cool to ride a train to college, but we have people that go to work that commute on the spine and come into it, like under San Francisco system where they have a spine and people come in from the sides.
Point well taken. The San Francisco system voted to build that system back when this region voted against it, which is why we're playing catch-up ball. I would argue, to your question, is there a way of redirecting dollars from one project to another sought-after project? I think the short answer is that my general counsel will tell you is not without an affirmative vote of the voters. Once the voters have adopted a plan, we are obligated to build the plan as adopted, including even to the station locations identified in the plan, unless there's extraordinary circumstances in which it became totally unaffordable or there was a practical feasibility, a geologic finding that this actually happened once in LA where they found that they were building through a methane field and had to terminate that. But
so
now that is not.
You're all too aware that the people who know the transportation issues here the best. The Pierce County voters voted against that plan. So,
the answer to your question is that we are obligated to vote the plan as adopted by the voter, build the plan as adopted by the voters, absent either like I said, very extenuating circumstances, of which I believe those circumstances are prescribed in law, and or I should say, or an affirmative act of the voters to do something different. So could an ST4 conceived of someday, and please do not take my words to be advocating for an ST4. We are plenty busy as it is. But could the voters choose to do something different at a later time? Certainly they could.
So it has to be an ST 3.1.
We could brand this any number of different ways, Mayor. moving on. So this pretty well displays, if you will, the whole panoply of South Sound investments. We talked about Federal Way and getting onto Tacoma Dome. So in total, we have 11 expansion projects underway or planned for South King and Pierce counties. We are working very hard to deliver them. We have grown very quickly as an agency in order to make sure that we are in planning and design at the appropriate stage to try to maintain the delivery dates that we promised to the voters. And you see those delivery dates adjacent to every one of those projects. I will say, be kidding to say that it's not going to be a challenge. Just to give you a flavor, in 2023, we will open 10 stations to the east side on Eastlink. In 2024, 1 year later, we're scheduled to complete an open service to Federal Way, while also completing an opening service to Linwood, while also extending Eastlink 2 more stations to Redmond, all in 2024. And our commitment is to try to build the bench strength and the ability to deliver. You know, and in 2024, the network will be dramatically different in terms of its reach and opportunities to get up from the south, to get down from the north, to get in from the east. And also, to my earlier point, it's not all about getting in and getting out, but I think that was an important point that actually the professor made. In a lot of these cities, there are many people who are commuting out, but there are many, many people commuting in. And how do we provide an opportunity for them to do that? Challenges, I'll speak to a few. One that we've been clear on, we have not waited for bids to come in to report to the board and the public that we're seeing cost growth. We have in 2 particular areas, and you can see they're almost identical in terms of the 2 biggest cost drivers. We, in the ST3 plan, updated our cost estimates based on what we thought would be appropriate increases in the cost of property, but anyone who's either bought a home or sold a home in this region understands that prices have skyrocketed at a level that almost nobody has predicted. And as a result, since we have to pay fair market value for any property that we procure, we also have to pay those much higher property values. So you can see for our Linwood Link project, property costs went up some 44%, for Federal Way 45%. And we're also in the hottest construction market that anyone can really recall. Now, I will say, in fairness, there have been times that Sound Transit has benefited from going to bid for projects at the bottom of the market. And we got very, very aggressive prices as a result. We were able to deliver from the airport down to Angle Lake 5 years earlier than planned, because the combination of a federal grant and the fact that the market was at the bottom, we got very, very aggressive pricing to do that. But right now, we're about the business of procuring projects at the top of the market. We're hoping it's going to cool a bit. I will say there was even an article in the Wall Street Journal today. The steel price tariffs are not helping as a capital constructor in terms of what's happening in our costs and the cost that must be borne by the public. But interest rates have stayed fairly low, and our revenues have stayed very solid. So all things being equal, our plan continues to be affordable, but these higher labor costs, labor shortage, the very hot market, and the rise in property construction has put some pressure on the plan. Other areas that have been a challenge, we got some very, very good news last week on federal grants, but the new administration has changed their posture compared to the prior administration on federal support. Fortunately for us, Congress has not, on a very bipartisan, bicameral basis. The Congress, both House and Senate, Democrats and Republicans, have been rejecting the proposals to cut off the federal funding spigot. We have a very, very modest expectation of federal funds for our program. It's only 16%, 1/6. You'll see a lot of projects out there or agencies that are asking for 50% federal money. Ours is only 16, and for the Linwood extension, the very, very good news we received is the administration has followed through and signaled their intention to sign a 1.2 full funding grant agreement for Linwood about the 3rd week in December. It was very good news for having pierced through that. I think, frankly, the region's commitment to local funding and local overmatch really helped us in our discussions, as did the business community in our discussions with the administration on getting that funding over the finish line. But our next federal grant is hopefully for the Federal Way extension, for which we're only asking for 25% federal funding. Sorry, please, go ahead.
Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mayor. Why so low, the 16% on the federal grants? Because I'll just play devil's advocate with you. Why not 25? Why not 35? Because if transportation is central to what we heard the professor say, then that money's going to pay itself off in the long run.
Oh, you'll have no argument with me on that. And just by way of background, in a prior life, I headed the federal agency that allocated those grants, but I also advocated to the board when I got here that they actually lower their number. And that was because I didn't think it was reasonable that just because this region was going to dramatically increase its appetite, that the federal government would also raise its budget for that program in kind. So just because, frankly, earlier programs I was able to pull down like 40 or 50% for their program, we have a combination of some very competitive projects that for which we know there's going to be very robust ridership, like going up to Linwood, like going down to Federal Way, where we know we can compete. We also have some projects that we can move more quickly by not using federal dollars. But even without knowing where the election was heading, I kind of felt like our initial expectation was ambitious. We have had other benefits too, I would point out. So right at the end of 2016, we signed what's called a master credit agreement with the United States Department of Transportation. We're the only transportation agency of any kind, highway, transit, maritime, or other, that has this. And it has enabled us to secure about $2 billion in what's called TIFIA loans. It makes for very, very affordable credit. We already have the best credit rating of any transit agency in the country, and this makes it even more affordable because we can defer principal and interest until the project is up and running. That master credit agreement by itself will save Puget Sound taxpayers between about $200 and $300 million. So what we're not doing on the grant side, I'd say we're doing on the loan side at very, very affordable rates.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
I have a question about and I heard the news a number of months ago on the Linwood line that you show those cost growth factors, 44%, 45%, 37%, 36%, but then the news is you can absorb them. Is there, and so in my mind, I say, well, how much fluff do they have if you can have a cost increase of 44% and still not have to cut back on the size? Are you cutting back on the size and scope of the project, or is there just a ton of swag there, or
fair question,
or do you just have that much money in the system where you can do that? Because I mean, if our costs went up on a project 44%, we'd have to be bringing in money from breaking piggy banks all over the place.
So I think it's a good question, but I got to give you a multifaceted answer. So the project did not go up 44%. Just the property component of it went up 44%. So the project percentage growth, while those were important driving factors, they weren't we just pulled those two out as the largest items. What we've always said, and we say the same thing for Linwood and Federal Way, is if the project costs grew to a certain level, the issue wouldn't be if we got to Linwood or if we got to Federal Way. To the point that I made earlier to the mayor, we are obligated to build the projects as the voters adopted them. It's when. And if the costs grow too high, so Linwood actually was, because of the challenges with the administration and getting them to follow through on their federal grants, we did have to defer from 2023 to 2024 delivering Linwood. It's one of the ways that we made up the difference. So yes, it's also important to remember that, again, when the voters adopt a plan, they adopt a map and they adopt a tax increase to pay for it. If the cost of those projects get more expensive, we continue to collect the taxes until we can build a map and then roll those taxes back to the levels just necessary to maintain what we built.
So that's another question is, what requires the taxes to be rolled back?
We make what's envisioned, and it hasn't happened yet because Sound Move is followed by ST2, ST2 is followed by ST3. But the board is obligated to roll the taxes back when the projects are completed to the levels necessary to maintain just enough revenue to operate, maintain, and recapitalize it. And that's a very, very important thing, Mayor, because there has been a history in this country with transit agencies not budgeting adequate funds to keep up with
infrastructure in general, but it's infrastructure in general.
Absolutely. But we at least have something baked into our system where there's a funding stream to recapitalize it.
So, now that we've, I guess, established that there is a continuing funding source from that, is there any technology or innovations on the horizon that would lower the cost of light rail or similar transportation systems? A lot of what we're looking at is really technology that's been around for a long, long time. If you took a futurist, or maybe one step back from a futurist, and someone who has some grounded understanding of where technology is going, is there anything you're looking at that would improve on the light rail system, or either from a product standpoint or a cost standpoint?
I'm going to give you sort of a broad answer. I think one of the innovations in this, and it's not a light rail innovation, but one of the innovations that I was thinking about when the professor was speaking earlier, because it's something that we're all grappling with as agencies. We always say the best and most affordable transit trip is the one that someone doesn't have to take. People have looked at why, transit ridership in our region continues to grow. In other regions of the country, it has actually begun to dip, even in a fairly healthy economy. That may change depending on what happens with gas prices, but I think a lot of the answer to that is actually increased use of telecommuting, of giving people, they can be so technologically linked to their workplace without traveling to the workplace. All of the innovations that you could load onto a laptop now, other than being physically there, you can be looking at the same set of files and having face-to-face conversations with your coworkers. And in a region like this, where people have to travel hours to get to or from work, it's an extraordinarily appetizing, enticing option for employers. On the technology of innovations in light rail technology itself, most of the things that I've looked at are not massive game changers in terms of cost. There are things in terms of lighter weight, more costly, less costly materials that could hold some promise. There are technologies that allow us to space rail cars a little bit more densely in order to get throughput. That holds some promise. But in terms of, are we getting away from rail cars that need to be crash-worthy, that are pulling down electricity over a solid guideway? I am not familiar with dramatic changes in that technology.
Mr. Branstad.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The late 2030s, almost all the way to 2040, if you have any more Linwood type things of where you have to push a date out for something, is likely to be there. I think that's a long ways. And I think that voters would be very surprised to hear your comments today that they approved a plan that was as inflexible as you describe it, that can't be adjusted over the next 20 years to do some things. you know, I think voters certainly knew they were approving dollars and that they were approving the concept of a transportation network, but I don't think that they would say that, and it was as inflexible in terms of stations and where and sequence and all of that, with no allowance for making adjustments within 20 years of where a significant new, say, you know, use Sumner as an example, but I could as easily use any one of a number of other places of where a significant employment center grew up because of things to be able to do that, and that they would be, you know, see, the plan can't be adjusted to make a right turn or add a station or do something. I really don't think that that's what the voters that have, what they know what they provided you is the funding, and they provided the funding informed by the vision of what could be built with that funding. But you know, I would encourage you to not be hesitant. You said you'd have to go back to the voters to say, we want to change the plan, instead of going here, we want to go there, or we want to go in a different order. I'd say, you know, don't be hesitant to do that if you can play a more positive role in the development of the region, and of the people that are here now, as well as the people that are going to come. I kind of heard, I guess when I listened to you, I sort of imagine the pilot who's flying me to New York, who takes off from SeaTac and turns it on to autopilot, and when he gets over Pennsylvania, he'll, you know, somebody will wake him up and so he can land. You know, I would hope that you can foster within your organization, with your board and with your staff, and that, you know, the willingness to be able to say, we've got to change the plan, and ask for the approval, and even be thinking about how should the plan be changed, instead of being in the autopilot about, this is what we said so in 2016, so this is what we've got to be doing in 2036.
Well, let me just comment. It may not be as inflexible as I describe it, only because there is precedent. This happened once in Renton and one other place where a project in the plan was deemed to be infeasible. An alternative plan that provided the same mobility for the same community was allowed to be done, but it was a very rare circumstance. Generally, when the board has to revisit the plan, it could be for bad news, as there was in 2008 and 2009, when the recession was so steep and our revenues were hit so hard that they had to defer or cancel some things. That some of those parking projects that I showed you in the South Sound were ST2 projects that were suspended in 2008 and 2009, but then started back up when the economy improved. I think importantly, it's not Sound Transit that provides the rigidity here. This is embedded in state statute. So in order to, you know, provide us some flexibility, like I said, it would either need to go back to the voters, or at a minimum, the legislature, I think. You know, what I've heard from my general counsel is that it would pretty much have to take the voters to undo what the voters did. Now,
and I think you're right that is the clearest way to make adjustments to a voter-approved program, but that those same statutes that provide rigidity provide the process to get around that if there's good reason to.
Well, let me give you an example. To the north, there is a station envisioned in the plan out at Payne Field. because the decision was made as part of the plan to not run the spine right up I-5 to Everett, but to go to the Payne Field Job Center. Now, just today, United Airlines is starting to sell flights out of Payne Field. Alaska Airlines is already doing that. There's going to be a rich discussion up there as to whether the station should be at the Boeing plant or at the airport. That, the Snohomish County folks are going to have to engage in richly. So we're not locked into a latitudinal and longitudinal coordinate of a station. But when we say we're putting a station, for example, in South Tacoma, we need to put one in South Tacoma. There is obviously a lot of work that goes on with the municipalities to things like actual locations and what's the optimal location for that, for the economic growth and the local vision of the community on where they want transit to be. I still haven't gotten through the entire series of risks, so I'll go through them very quickly. Federal grants we talked about. State legislation, there has been a rich dialogue as to the motor vehicle excise tax depreciation schedule in Olympia. That is one that we are using the same depreciation schedule that we have been required to use since 1996, in which the legislation expressly requires us to use. There has been interest in the legislature of revisiting that, and our board has been open to revisiting that so long as we are effectively held harmless in terms of our impact on revenues. There have been proposals to address that issue that have had a relatively minimal impact on our revenues, and there are some that have not only adjusted the depreciation schedule, but sought to cut the tax dramatically, which would undermine our ability to deliver the plan. So that is one in which the board continues to be engaged with Olympia. We've actually gone forward and provided to the legislature in Olympia 5 separate ideas on how they might be able to make up to us any revenue lost from a change in the depreciation schedule. And we'll, in the new session, we'll see if the legislation moves forward again, and we'll be engaged with them to try to make something that works for the legislature and also works for our capital program. Economic factors, we've already talked about project cost pressures. Economic factors is really about the fact that the majority of business economists are predicting a recession of some size sometime in the next 3 years. Depending on the depth of that recession and its duration would make dramatically differences in terms of how negatively it would impact our plan. And I don't, in that regard, I don't think we're in any different boat than any of the municipalities that are dependent on sales taxes and other taxes. And that pretty much completes my presentation. If you have any other questions, I'm happy to take them.
Any other questions? Ms. Moss?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And Peter, thank you. And Chelsea, it's good to see you again. Good to see you. You know, I've always been fascinated with the future planning. And I learned a lot on that board about how the challenges that you face going through situations like that. But I do have 2 questions. You know my favorite. How full is our parking lot here at the station? And with the anticipated population growth, are there plans to expand it?
There is an access project in Lakewood that could potentially provide some expansion of parking. That hasn't been determined yet because it's later in the plan, but we'll obviously be in a conversation with the city about that. Again, like I said earlier, we always, the lot is filling up here rather robustly now. We will never be able to build enough parking, but our goal is to try to provide some kind of combination of access, including, you know, bike, pedestrian. We had a partnership with Uber and Lyft as a pilot in the South Sound. Sort of fascinating, but a certain city that I'm familiar with in a northeastern state, rather than build a new parking lot for access to their commuter rail system, decided to plow that money into a revolving fund for Uber and Lyft. That's the way they made sure that only their city's residents got the benefit. rather than people coming in from all kinds of other cities and parking in a lot that they would have paid for. So there's a variety of ideas that are out there, but we want to be able to, we know the growth is coming in terms of especially Sounder South ridership, and we want to be able to make sure we can accommodate it.
Right, thank you.
Mr. Matt, just a quick follow-up on that. When you mentioned the people who are coming from other places, and we know anecdotally that here in Lakewood, a good portion of the folks that are filling up the parking garage here are from Thurston County. And that's only going to become a greater percentage in places like DuPont.
Yep.
Is there any move toward charging parking to out of transit taxing area residents to favor the folks who are actually paying for the system over the what were perceived as freeloaders from Thurston County?
It's a complicated answer. So first, let me say the board has adopted a policy that we will eventually move to paid parking across all of our parking facilities. We are starting some initial steps right now. So we have, and I'll get to that distinction in district, out of district in a second. We now, for a very, very nominal charge, you can get at about 10 lots that we're piloting what's called an HOV. It's basically a high occupancy parker permit. So if you bring more than one commuter to the lot, you could actually have a reserved, you can get a cheap permit to have a reserved spot. We have just this past month kicked off our first single occupancy vehicle permit because we just opened a new garage up at Northgate. It's part of the Northgate rail extension. But we will be doing that at a number of other lots over time where you will be able to purchase a single occupancy permit to guarantee you a parking space. And if you're not there by 9 o'clock, then anyone can park in those spaces. Importantly, the board did have a discussion about now would we market and allow someone outside the taxing district to purchase one of those permits, and their answer was no. I think there is a lot of sensitivity, not just at the southern end of the system, but also I hear the same concern in Snohomish County of folks coming in from eastern Snohomish County who are outside the taxing district but coming in and filling the lot. So I think the board is quite sensitive to this issue about who is paying into the system and who is not. And my guess, I don't want to presume what their policy positions will be going forward, but my guess is those same concerns will rear their head when we roll out this paid parking regime. There's another aspect to this, and that is the folks who park in our lot who don't use transit at all. And that has been a concern. So when we do have a closed system, we already do this with these HOV permits. If you purchase them, you have to give us your ORCA card number, and we will then verify whether you actually tapped onto the transit system or not. And if you haven't used it often enough, or if you didn't tap on the system, we'll revoke your permit. And that may be the key, because we have a number of lots, including in some of the Sounder South lots, where we know that folks are parking very early in the morning and are not boarding our system, and that's not why the taxpayer built that lot. So, Mr. Bulkey.
I'm going to credit Councilmember Branstetter with this question because in some correspondence on email, I believe to the city manager, there's a question about our maintenance facility or the maintenance facility you were going to build here, Lakeview Drive, I bet. What is the status of that? Because I go by there and I wouldn't know what your final,
currently,
so what's the status of it and how many people will end up working
I think there's going to be about 50 people working there, and our target to complete it is the fourth quarter of 2022. That's going to be an important facility for us. It also enables us to bring some of our maintenance in-house at probably more affordable rates for the taxpayer.
Thank you. Other questions? A couple more. Status of, from your standpoint of the negotiations regarding the Gravity Lake Drive to Thorn Lane connector.
Is this the the WashDOT project.
The WashDOT project.
Yeah, our understanding was, and you and I discussed this some time ago, Mayor, WashDOT has sequenced these projects and it's on their schedule. I think at one point there was some representation that we are currently in discussions with WashDOT over what is effectively when we use their property, we lease it. When they use our property, we expect them to lease it from us. But my understanding, and we just reconfirmed this before we came down here, there's nothing about that ongoing discussion that impacts the schedule on that project. There's been no change in the date to our understanding in terms of WashDOT's plans, and the staffs are moving forward with those lease conversations.
So there's still no agreement as to the use of the right-of-way at this point?
There's no final lease papers signed yet, but my understanding, at least from our inquiries at WashDOT, is that it's not influencing the timing of the deployment of the project.
We get varying reports, so.
Well, quite honestly,
so I thought
since we run buses, we're accustomed to being thrown under them, but I do believe that there may have been some representation that somehow our insisting on a lease was somehow changing the delivery date of the project. We don't believe that's factually correct.
So has the size of the width and location of the right-of-way or easement that's needed for the project been determined, been agreed?
I'd have to get more detail for you on that, Mayor, but we can get to you or John in the next couple of days.
That'd be very nice to know if they're...
Okay. That should not be hard to find out.
We have a lot of things that we end up coordinating, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, with WashDOT. And,
right.
and that one has, I'd say, been... Yeah, that has changed from time to time.
Well, and we, with the amount of operation and envision, not just heading south, but also heading north along WashDOT property, we actually now have WashDOT staff domiciled in our buildings because we are so in each other's business on a full-time basis that we've found it to be a best practice where we can have them nearby, and they appreciate being able to work closely with us. So we should be able to get you an answer to that quickly.
The final thing I had is just, I don't know how aware you are, but we have been for some time pursuing funds for an analysis of the ability to site an Amtrak station in the Fort Lewis DuPont area. And after a number of years in which we were told back at Congress that it was Amtrak money, now it turns out it's state money. So that's a legislative priority for us at this point, and I anticipate that eventually we will be successful in that endeavor and get an analysis. So we want to work closely with you, of course, in citing whether there's even possibilities like using Lakewood for a temporary station if it.
We are happy to support your request for that analysis. It should be well worth it, given that all that the community has been through in the wake of the Nisqually disaster. We would happily support having a look at that. I can't tell you, until we see the analysis how it comes up, but I've articulated that to John, and we're happy to do whatever we can to help you get that analysis.
Yeah, it's good. JBLM has the same viewpoint on that as it does with as to your stations. They would like to see something right outside the gate that their people could get on and use. And it makes a lot of sense.
We want to serve them. That's what I was saying before. It is unfortunate. We have to phase these projects in terms of their affordability, and that one's toward the end of the plan. But we already own that property. That's one, like I said, a project I think you can justify tomorrow if we could get it done.
Mr. Boki.
Yeah, I'm just looking at your third quarter report, and there's numbers all over the place, and you mentioned a number of different things. What do you feel like has been the most successful endeavor that Sound Transit has done, or the most successful portion of Sound Transit? And what would you, and what would, been the least successful endeavor that you've had, and how does that color your future plans?
Well, I've only been with the agency for 3 years, though I've worked with it in other positions. I actually think it has become unsung, and I'll probably give you a surprising answer. But we are the #1 commuter bus operator in the United States. Commuter bus being defined in the National Transit Database as, suburb to center city operations. And when the voters did turn down forward thrust in 68 and 70, they did stand up, and one of the earliest things that Sound Transit did as a regional provider was to become a very robust commuter bus operator. Now, that is very much under duress right now because of the performance of the HOV lanes and just how congestion, and so our arc into rail is coming much later than it has from cities, from municipal areas that are smaller. But having stood up that bus capacity for folks was critically important. They saw the need and they filled it, right? And I think that that's still what we're about the business of doing, but we're never going to grow the highway capacity now to the ability where they'll be time competitive, and we're now trying to do the same thing. Least successful? There were, I think, especially in the early years, one of the things that has changed a lot in terms of people's attitude toward introducing rail, especially light rail, for a lot of communities, they weren't really sure whether they wanted it, and it's followed an arc that is very similar to what's happened in a lot of other cities. It's happened in Dallas, it's happened in Denver, where mayors and community leaders go from arguing vociferously as to whether this is a reasonable investment at all, to then arguing with each other as to who gets the next extension first. And that's where I think that's sort of been the biggest change in Sound Transit's arc, at least as it relates to the light rail expansion. And that is, we are now having people arguing about why one other community is getting it first, and these are some of the very same leaders that weren't sure they wanted it in the first place. And that's what a doubling congestion in 5 years will do to folks, right? Well, I want to answer your question. I think in those early years, Sound Transit had to make some investments, and I'm not going to get into specifics or name names, but we paid for some things at the insistence of some municipalities that really weren't central to our mission and maybe weren't the best use of transit dollars, but they got paid for anyway just to be able to make something happen. And that is something I'm also glad that we moved away from.
Yeah, I would agree with you on the bus. I'll tell you, I think it's, and for a variety of reasons, that the bus system works really well, especially like to commute to the airport and back and various things like that. And it's a really good tool to use when people are visiting or families coming in and various things like that. We still make trips up there, but it really has helped a lot, and it's very efficient service, like you say, except for the traffic issues.
The challenge right now is, in order to maintain our timetable, we actually have to procure more and more buses to put them on the road because the trip is taking so much longer, folks. It's as unpredictable as it is. We just had this coming down. There was absolutely no distinction between the HOV speed and the single occupancy speed coming down here tonight. Just none.
I would have to agree. As a Pierce Transit Board member, we appreciate the business from Sound Transit, but I think in my opinion, the 574 and 594 are the best public transportation in Lakewood, including the Sounder. They move a lot of people.
Well, we can run it any time of the day, which we can't do with Sounder. Yeah. And I hope we'll get there someday, but we're not there yet.
A weekend trip.
I hear you.
One.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for braving the commute And hopefully you'll have a more robust sounder schedule so you can take the train next time.
And, well, then I would get back, right?
Yeah.
For your very point. We will get you answers on where we are with WashDOT on that, and some of those
That'd be
details
great.
on the alignment. And, you know, obviously the dialogue doesn't need to only happen when you invite me. I mean, if you all have further questions or concerns, just please let us know.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So, if I can get the attention of Ms. Kelly Fong, I'm going to play with the agenda here a little bit because I think she has the shortest presentation. And I see we have an agenda arranged by seniority again. Shannon. We've rearranged the agenda on my representation that you have the shortest presentation and yeah.
Do I still get to keep the senior?
So you get to go home early if you don't make a liar out of me. So we move to review of the public defender contract.
All right, good evening, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, council members. I'm here tonight to review the proposed primary public defender contract for 2019 to 2020, with an extension possible to 2022 by mutual agreement of both parties. Since 2016, the city has received primary public defender services from Horwath Law. The city's current contract terminates on January 31st, 2019. While this contract includes a 2-year extension provision, it is recommended that the city execute a new contract with Horwath Law for public defender services based on the caseload trends that the city has seen. The city originally executed a contract with Horwath Law for primary public defender services back in 2016. Per this contract, there were a base provision for 1,600 cases per a 12-month period. Any additional cases assigned to the firm were charged to the city at a fixed rate per case. In 2017, the city amended the contract with Horwath Law, increasing the base compensation, and with this increase also increasing the case number per the primary defenders to 2,000 cases rather than 1,600 cases, so an increase of 400 cases per a 12-month period. Again, any additional cases above the 2,000 cases were charged to the city at a fixed rate. As you can see from Table A and Table B in the memorandum in front of you, the city's primary public defender caseload has averaged around 1,600 cases per year since 2011, with the exception of 2016 and 2017. And this high volume in 2016 can be explained in large part due to the change in primary public defender firms. The city had a contract with a different firm and then decided to go with Horwath Law in 2016. And as a result, some of the cases previously assigned to the previous firm were then assigned to Horwath Law, increasing the number in 2016. So essentially, the city was charged twice for some cases during this transition period. Based on historical data from the city, it's recommended that the city enter into a contract in which the base compensation provides coverage for 1,600 cases rather than 2,000 cases per a year. During contract negotiations, Horwath Law requested an increase in the base compensation to provide adequate funding to cover calendar and docket services, which Horwath Law currently does at Lakewood Municipal Court. The city reviewed the request and increased the base compensation, as you can see by Table C, which itemizes the base compensation in the proposed contract. The recommendation is to authorize the city manager to execute the proposed contract for primary public defenders for 2019 to 2020, which is included in this packet as Attachment A. This will be presented to the City Council as part of the December 3rd, 2018 regular City Council meeting. Any questions concerning this contract?
Questions from Ms. Kelly Fong? How do they pay their overhead at those rates?
How many lawyers typically are on that contract?
On average, there are 5 lawyers per the contract, but 4 to 6 typically during the period of the year. Previously, the firm had. Currently, they only contract with the city of Lakewood.
Any other questions? Well, thank you very much. Pardon me? Now, in our reverse order, go to the third quarter police report. Mr. Zarro. Chief Zarro. Yeah, they walk in with a stack of files, shuffle them, they're all in the same document. And then sometimes they have to work.
Thank you, Mayor Anderson and council members. This is our, I don't know if that's too loud, third quarter report. We'll go through this quickly in respect of your time, and obviously stop me if I'm going too fast or if you have any questions. There we are. So as you can see, calls for service were down, or excuse me, up a little bit from the second quarter. As were arrests in general. One of the things, you know, I always like to make sure I include a typo, so the I know the city manager's paying attention. In this case, it was on the total under year-to-date 2018, and this is a column that we added this time. In the past, we compared third quarter this year to third quarter last year is what it would have been, and I don't know that that was a real meaningful number. So I thought year-to-date might be might mean more to you as far as where we're at is on a trend line. The number that should be on the bottom of year-to-date 2018 for the cumulative should be 4,831, which would mean about a 1.8% decrease in overall crime. And you can see that through these numbers, simple assaults are still our biggest driver of persons crimes, and burglaries and thefts, larceny, are our biggest driver of property crimes, but there was a decrease in both year-to-date 18 over 17.
What's an example of extortion? Seems to be going up.
It could be a lot of what we see there is over the internet or over social media. I don't think there's any real hardcore extortion going on that you might think of, you know, from TV and movies, but it's what the report's titled, so that's where the numbers come from. Yes, sir.
You mentioned in your comments and towards the end, but now that you mentioned it, motor vehicle theft, that maybe the fever's finally broke, that you're starting to see some decreases. I don't know if that's continuing into the fourth quarter, but you mentioned it towards the end, you have those comments, but.
Right, in the analysis towards the end, there's a reference to a decrease, a trending decrease in vehicle thefts, which I can't attribute that to any one thing, but I've always, and it's been a few years since I've done it. I don't know how many of you remember, but I did sort of a comparison of our city to others, and if you look at like the number of parking lots that we have, our population and all that, we actually have a pretty low rate of vehicle theft. I think Gig Harbor and Ording and Bonnie Lake were significantly higher than ours. But even with that, we have seen a decrease in vehicle thefts over not just the past few months, but I think going back to last year. The burglary number, absolutely. And if there's one property crime number that I would want to drive down more than any other, it's burglaries, particularly residential burglaries, because that's people's homes, and that's where you should feel the safest. Dogs for Doberman pinchers for everybody. It's very effective. Very effective.
They do more damage than the burglar does.
Oh, that's all right. And again, we're looking at our motel and apartment reports. A lot of them driven by the same, or a lot of the same apartments that we see and the same motels that we see, but not a ton of calls for service, particularly in our apartments. And you look, you know, some of our biggest apartment complexes are not on either of these. We do see the same ones. We work frequently with the apartment managers, as I've talked about, if we have an incident occur in the middle of the night when the apartment managers might not be aware, or maybe they are and they just want to ignore it, we try and make contact with them in the days following so that they know that we're watching, just to kind of make sure that they're doing the best they can with their tenants. And then mobile home parks, and we've talked about these and some of the difficulties in managing some of the crime rates and the calls for service in the mobile home parks. The car one is still at the top of our list. We still are working very slowly and methodically to make permanent improvements as opposed to just putting Band-Aids on things, but it's tough. But it is one of the primary focuses of CSRT, and just some of the efforts that are put into addressing not just the individual trailers, which are owned independently of the land that they're on, but also the property owners as well. In-person crime by quarter, as you can see, we have some troughs and valleys there. What we hope is that some peaks and valleys. What we hope is that the peaks keep getting smaller and the troughs go deeper. We are seeing, I think a very slight decrease overall in some of the person's crimes. It's kind of hard to appreciate because we have had the number of homicides that we've had this year kind of put this idea in your mind that, there's a lot more violent crime or person's crimes, when it's really not the case. We've had a lot more high-profile incidents.
So why?
Yes, sir.
There's seasonal patterns, but why is the third quarter number the peak in one year and the second quarter seems to be the peak in others? Is there a reason for that?
None that I could really point to. I mean, it might be interesting looking at what the weather is during those years and see if maybe there's a warmer second quarter, because warm weather plus alcohol usually equals property or person's crimes.
Yeah, that's what, my guess would be you'd expect the third quarter to go up because the sun comes out and days are longer, and
exactly.
People drink more. But the second quarter of the last couple of years have been the peak, and that just seems to be an anomaly.
Global warming.
It is warm enough for the third quarter.
When you have a PhD in psychology, let us know. Otherwise, just ignore it.
Then we have our Western State Hospital numbers that we've been tracking for some time now, and we have seen, obviously, the spike over the second quarter. They were, we're not where we were, in 2015, 16, and even parts of 17, but it's still trending upward, and I don't know how much of that has to do with reporting. I also, now in hindsight, don't know how much the reduced numbers have to do with them displacing patients out into the community versus keeping them in the hospital where they belong. Right. So if you move them out to adult family homes, then your assaults within the hospital are going to go down. And then property crime by quarter, again, we've seen some significant decreases, which are always nice, and on a downward trend. One of the things that will be interesting for the fourth quarter is what we did over on Black Friday and Thanksgiving night, and actually through the month of October, or the end of October and through November, we had kind of a zero tolerance on retail theft, and people went to jail if they got caught shoplifting. And then on Friday, we had a very visible presence throughout the town center on bikes. And did they? Well, yeah. You're the suspicious person they were chasing around. At Lowe's and over by Hobby Lobby as well. One initial bit of feedback we got was from Old Navy and their loss prevention there, who said that they know specifically that we deterred about $4,000 worth of theft. because they actually saw people with armloads of stuff heading for the door. One of our guys on bikes go by and then drop their armloads of stuff and head out, and that happened a couple times. So it'll be interesting to look at some of the theft and vehicle prowl reports as well that occurred over Black Friday and Thanksgiving, and just see what kind of difference that presence made. And word does get around when you start arresting, because it's the same people committing the crimes over and over again. It's the same little community. Word gets around when they hear that you're going to go to jail if you shoplift or steal in Lakewood, or that, hey, there's cops everywhere, stay out of Lakewood. Word gets around. So I think it obviously I would hope would have a good impact.
Like 4,000 is a felony, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so does our prosecuting attorney prosecute those? Do they get prosecuted?
Well, if they went through with it, because they didn't go through with it, because that's what I mean, they saved it because they saw our officers ride by on a bicycle and threw down all the stuff before they left the store.
Are we going to continue the increased presence during the Christmas holiday?
Yes, yeah, sporadically. I don't know about like every weekend, but definitely throughout the month we want to have more of those. And they love it.
Yeah, I think they would love them. I saw the decreased presence, and I thought it was fantastic because it kept, people driving crazy too. I mean, you see the guys out there on the bikes and a lot of police presence, and people were, I think, calmer at the intersections in town center, in the stores, and so it probably also kept some of the vagrant begging issues maybe down. I don't know, anecdotally I didn't hear, but yeah. I think that increased presence is fantastic. We can figure out a way to do more of that.
Yeah, and just in the bikes and alone, citizens seem to love, and the officers love doing it. So it's just something different, and even with the weather the way it was on Friday, they were out there and loved being out there.
Yeah. It's surprising.
That was one of the comments I heard. It's raining, and look at the police. I say, yeah, the Lakewood police is.
That's right. That's right. And you all bought them some pretty expensive rain gear, so they should be out in the weather. And then Walmart, we've still seen, I mean, we're seeing very low numbers from where they peaked in 2016. And some of that, I think, has to do with policy changes that they've made as far as what they will and won't call us for. I can tell you, though, I mean, that we had an officer Thanksgiving night working off duty there, standing in uniform inside the doors with a patrol car out front, and people would still come in and steal. They'd get arrested, and the officer working would ask them if they saw him, and they'd say, yeah, but, we thought we'd get away with it. So it's a little frustrating, but just as far as a statistical report, it's still looking like they're staying on their downward trend, or at least flatlined on their low end there. And then crimes against society, again, these are our drug crimes, and they're still, a little bit lower. A lot of these are self-generated. I think what we're looking at is bigger arrests as opposed to a bunch of little individual ones. And then our total crime. Again, a slight, if you looked had a trend line on there, would be a slight decrease, which is always the goal. In the districts at a glance, and as I've said before, other than traffic stops, a lot of what we see are domestic violence calls. And again, welfare checks are things like, there's a suspicious person, or go check on so-and-so didn't show up for work, can you please go check on them, and things like that we do actually fairly frequently. And aside from the criminal calls for service, the most calls that we get are for non-typically criminal incidents or criminal situations, like just suspicious persons, that people see something that makes them uncomfortable, or that they just want to call us for. Welfare checks again. And again, domestic violence is present almost in every district. And then the traffic stops, we had talked in quarters past about the decrease and what could be leading to those. They seem to have flattened out and have even increased from last quarter. And I suspect once we get some of our newer officers out, on their own, we're going to see that number go up again. And then collisions also, and I think you've heard me say before that I was, nationally collisions have been, especially serious collisions have been a significant issue throughout the country, and we were no different. And to see them drop down the past couple quarters was good. I'd still like to see fewer, but moving in the right direction, at least slowly. And some of the analysis, this is just a recap of some of the high-profile incidents we've had. We've had a few shootings and a couple of homicides. What I am happy to report is that we've identified suspects or made arrests in all of them. With the one of the homicides was ended up being self-defense, so there was no charge on that. The stabbing at the Jack in the Box, I think, gained some media attention. It was in McCord Gate where it was, I don't know that there was any media attention for that at all, but he was in a fight with 4 other people that, were intending to do him serious harm, and he was armed and shot and killed one of them. It was deemed justifiable, not by us, by the prosecutor's office after they reviewed it. And we talked a little bit before about the property crime steadily declining, and violent crime numbers still, we want them even lower, but they are still on the lower end as we look historically. Bars really, they are not the problem that they used to be. We had the exception of the New World, which it wasn't in the third quarter, it was in the fourth, but we had the New World VIP Lounge. There was a very just out of control, was likely pseudo-gang related shooting there, where one person died, and their business license has been revoked. And they've been closed since, and I don't see them opening back up anytime soon, if at all. And as we look at stats for the businesses in that strip mall, we do see, all the different businesses might have the same address, but it's suite A, B, or something like that. It all comes back to the New World. It's not the Kyoto restaurant that has, it's just a restaurant serving, sushi and teriyaki. They're not having the problems. It's the New World VIP that was the problem, and they've been taken care of. One of the, every once in a while, sort of an interesting stat, there is something I want to look at, will pop up, and I thought it was worth sharing. And that's the idea of victimless crime arrests. And I know one of the things that can become an issue for police departments is how they're focusing their efforts on crimes that don't really have a victim. And some of those can be disorderly conduct or obstructing, driving while license suspended, or drug arrests. And sometimes the perception could be that enforcement of those are on disproportionately focused on minority communities and poor neighborhoods. And I don't have that broken out, but I did want to look at, well, what percentage of our arrests, or how many of our arrests are considered would be victimless crimes, where there isn't like a burglary victim or an assault victim that you could point to. And it's about 14% of those total. And if you look at just disorderly and obstructing, it's 1.3 and 2.3% respectively. And usually with those, and even with the drug-related offenses, there's some other crime that goes along with it. The drugs were found after they were arrested for something else, or in just accompanying some other criminal activity. So just something I thought was interesting, and I thought sort of a positive that it was such a low number when you look at all those combined. And then finally, the Metro SWAT activity, I was asked to, I think it was at the last quarterly report, to include some report out of their activity. Moving forward might be a moot point, we still want to report on the current team's activity, but or what we're going to transition to. But you could see the activity here. We had 4 incidents that were in Lakewood, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that were out of Lakewood, and a couple of those that were out of Lakewood were requests for negotiators only. And we do, you know, they're considered part of this, an element of the SWAT team, so it's considered part of the analysis. But for those incidents, there was just negotiators, and those are almost exclusively for suicidal people. And as you can see, the 2 on the Narrows Bridge, that's exactly what they were for. And then there was one other to help Pierce County for, it's when they had the armed robber that was involved in the shootout and barricaded himself, and we had a special piece of equipment that we offered up, and they ended up not needing, but we sent somebody anyway, so we counted that as part of the work that was done. And then also involved in the activity was some of the training that they were both received and gave. 56 hours of training that they provided in different capacities to the metro agencies, and then the total of 100 hours of training for the team that they participated in. So, and that's the end of the third quarter report. I do want to say, as we finish up with the SWAT activity, I met with our Lakewood contingent of what was Metro SWAT today, and just kind of talked to them about where we're going, what their thoughts were on it. And I'd obviously talked to them last week after the decision to leave Metro SWAT was made, and they were disappointed. But meeting with them today, there was a definite shift towards enthusiasm for what we can build here, and just what they're still going to be able to do, the work that they enjoy doing, that they're still going to be able to do it. So it was a nice sort of turn today to see that from them, that there's more of an enthusiasm about what they can make of it than what they're losing.
Questions for Chief Sorrell? Mr. Branstetter.
Thank you, Mayor. Chief, found a lot of interest in the community among citizens and that regarding a greater awareness of the fact that there are registered sex offenders throughout the city, being able to go and do that. And could you give us a summary about what exactly the department's efforts are with monitoring and or other activities that are related to the fact that there are known sex offenders residing here?
Sure. So we're able to monitor. They're level 1, 2, and 3 have to register. Level 2s and 3s, and 3 is the worst, considered most likely to reoffend, are the only 2 we're able to give community notifications on. Level 1s we're not. We do receive, and this is technically the county's responsibility, the sheriff's department's responsibility. It's where they register, and that's who I think by statute is required to check on them. Through a pass-through from them, we receive money for our officers to do the checks, and we go out and do them monthly, where we announce it for officers that want to work overtime. They're given, the list of addresses to go out and check, and it's really a matter of going out, and that's all you do, is you knock on the door and see if they're there or they're still residing there. If they're not, then it's a criminal violation, and they write up a report for violating or for failing to register as a sex offender, only because they're not at the address they're registered at.
So, I guess, what's the turbulence about as your officers are checking periodically? How frequently do you find that the address is no longer a current address? And then that's a violation, but what does that precipitate?
And I think it's fairly infrequently that they're no longer at that address. Most of them keep their addresses fairly current. If somebody has moved and it's not the address that's on registration for them, then a report will be written and sent to the prosecutor for filing of charges against them, and then a warrant would get issued, and then they'll get picked up eventually or at some point. But that's usually
but that's something that is not handled through our municipal court or
Correct.
Our prosecutor.
Correct.
When you say prosecutor, you mean?
Pierce County prosecutor, yes.
Pierce County.
Yes.
Okay, be able to go and do that. And you said for level 2s and that, we're allowed to have a community notification process. So what really are our processes for, as far as community notification?
So we'll get a notice that somebody is coming out to a location in our community. We'll have our CSOs will send out notifications to a certain number of residences around the location. And usually that notice simply says the 100 block where they live. We can't put the specific house numbers. We also go to any schools or daycares that are within a reasonable distance and let them know as well.
Okay. Thank you. I had one other topic I wanted to ask you about. Is after a number of years of work and finally getting moving, that we're finally getting to having an up and running dashboard. Data involves all the departments of the city, but what are the particular most significant things from the police department that are going to be on that dashboard that then are going to be available in as real time as they're able to be posted? I'm
still working on that with Shannon. I go back and forth, and I certainly would be open to input from you all as to what you would like to see or think your neighbors would like to see in a dashboard like that. I mean, you can do crime rates and, you can do property crimes, person crimes, all those measurable things. I don't know how useful that is for community members. So I'd be open to input from you all on that. And one of the things that I also am sensitive to is the more information you put out about crime in Lakewood, whether good or bad, the more you're reminding people that there's crime in Lakewood, and there's crime everywhere. I could, residents in Bellevue or some other place that has traditionally low crime, if I put on their website, all the burglaries and vehicle prowls that occur every day, it's going to remind people that there are burglaries and vehicle prowls, and it's how much angst do you want to build over those incidents. So it's a matter of what do we want to put out to the public? Do we want to just inform them of, hey, here's what's going on, or what is the goal that we're trying to accomplish with this data?
Yeah. Well, I guess we can think about that and give you some feedback about what it is. I guess that I'm not 100% certain that the only audience for the dashboard data is the citizenry in general. I think that and I'd have to give some thought to it, but I think that there is the dashboard is valuable, I think, to us as we think about policy decisions, and I hope that it would be of value to you as you're making some internal management decisions, that it can be used by multiple audiences to be able to go and do that. I have to, appreciate the report, although I think over the last couple of years, the value of the data about motel calls for service is kind of at least decreased for me, as there are some of the motels that originally were on that are no longer here. You know, we kind of worked through that. I really don't know whether there is a significant number or there is, or even to know that, but I guess I would, as you report data on Western State Hospital, I guess that I would also be interested in taking a look, is there enough data to even do any reports regarding calls for service at adult family homes? Actually, I imagine that West Pierce probably gets more calls for service than the police department does that way, but if there was some way that that could be perhaps co-located, it's more a question of gather some data to see whether it's of value, rather than knowing that it'd be of value if we gathered it. That's all I have, Chief Mayor.
And if there is anything on this report that you would like to see that different, well, I love that feedback, because I want it to be something meaningful for you. So it's not just some numbers. I want you to walk away.
Well, actually, you have a slide that's talks about in each of the districts, it lists the top 3 things, and you have the dispatched and the observed calls for service to be able to do that. Since every district always has traffic as this top non-dispatched call for service, you might just agree with that and then add one more thing as a third thing going on down below.
Ms. Barth.
So one thing I think would be beneficial would be a comparison of cities, you know, burglary in Lakewood versus burglary in Gig Harbor versus Puyallup. And, you know, just maybe 3 different things: burglaries and personal.
You have the violent crime.
Yeah.
Personal crimes. Okay.
Yeah, and just to see how we compare, because I get so tired of hearing about it. And then when I say, oh, well, our crime rate is less than Gig Harbor, what?
Yeah.
You know, it would be nice to be able to.
And you don't have to pay a toll to get here either.
Yeah.
So.
Well, the average burglar in Gig Harbor makes a bigger haul than the average burglar.
Then he has to pay a toll to get back.
There you go.
Okay.
Mr. Whalen.
In that vein, I wanted to tee off your first comment about the patrols around the Central Business District over the weekend. I, for one, don't know how we frame that in a report, but I think the approach to proactive time in terms of patrolling, it doesn't necessarily result in a statistic. It avoids a statistic.
Right.
The statistics are really reactive. It reflects calls for service and the outcomes, right?
Absolutely.
And speaking of Puyallup, I was just reading a little bit online as we were sitting here. Puyallup passed their budget the other day, and there was a report in the paper today.
I read that, yeah.
And they went through, and I was reading this analysis by this company called Matrix Consulting that they engaged to have them do kind of a holistic overview.
Their staffing study, right?
The whole staffing study that supported their budget and resulted in the increase of budgeted officers to deal with proactive patrol time, which is really kind of interesting. And they defined, they looked at the analysis not from a number of officers per thousand, which we've talked about isn't necessarily an attractive or accurate metric, but based upon a percentage of proactive time for patrol officers, and they went through that versus active staffing levels. It was really kind of an interesting analysis that led them to increase their budget, which still, at the increased levels, is only 39% of their general fund for public safety. Ours is higher.
Their total budget's like $145 million.
It's huge. Yeah, it's a huge budget. But that would be kind of interesting to talk about, because anecdotally, you talk to people, neighbors, business people, there seems to be a desire, geez, I wish we'd have more proactive patrol presence. Certainly in the town center, in the neighborhoods, I think you guys are doing a lot of that. But that would be helpful, because I think it would reduce the knucklehead activity.
Yeah.
around town, because there's still a lot of it going on. You know, again, I don't know what the heck is going on with my buddies at the Lakewood Dental Building, but there's always something going on there, whether it's drug activity, needle stuff going on. Last night it was graffiti. They just put a $50,000 garbage enclosure in, and the guys painted over the whole front of it. You know, it's just crazy stuff. Yeah. He's got a video of the two
Train somebody.
guys, and I told him to send it on to you folks. But I think more proactive patrol activity, to the extent we can do that, given your tight staffing as it is, I think creates a lot of impression and presence, and I think it's good for the community. And I think it would result in perhaps lesser stats.
So I agree with respect to the proactive patrol. I'd caution on a matrix study, though.
I don't know who they are.
I've seen it before.
Yeah. Happy.
It was. Do us, what? It was made to order.
Probably. I don't want to pay money to do a study, but I think there's some good thoughts there.
What happened to the crimereports.com? I think it doesn't work.
It's not work?
There's no reports on it. You go, it's blank. It's been
Has it? Okay.
But it's like it's almost but other entities are like that too. So I don't know what.
Oh, like other entities that are using crime reports? Yeah. Oh, I don't know. I'll find out.
Any other questions? Mr. Branstetter, just one.
How is your honorary chief doing?
Chief Maddie's doing great. She is actually going to, I'm not sure to what extent, but take part in the parade that the chamber's putting on. Probably be riding with, actually might be riding with Sergeant Frazier, the truck that he's got. So she's doing well. They may have to move to Ohio for a heart transplant in the spring, but for right now, she's doing as well as can be expected.
Any other questions? Thank you very much,
And
Chief.
one last reminder before I go, Thursday we have our food drive and blood drive, and for those of you that have received any comments or complaints about the memorial at Blue Steel, where the flags have, I mean, they've whipped in the wind so much that they've kind of shredded, and the property owner there doesn't have any interest in maintaining any of that.
Where's this?
At Blue Steel Coffee, where you was Forza, it's where the shooting occurred. The coffee shop owner has done her best to try and keep up, and she and I actually met Friday, and we're going to do a better job collectively to maintain it, just because we are the ones that get the phone calls, both she and us, and I think some city staff as well. So,
But the food drive is at Lakewood PD, right?
Yes, food drive's there. Yep. Thursday morning we're going to be at the Blue Steel, just raising new flags and doing a little thing there. But just, I know different city staff have received calls and complaints about
different city council members.
Yes, and yeah. So it's being taken care of. We're working with Blue Steel to get those replaced and get the memorial looking better.
Just
Thank you.
Show up at the station for the blood drive?
6 o'clock in the morning.
No, that's for the food drive. The blood drive.
Bring your non-recyclable.
Not exactly sure. I think it's in the afternoon, but I'll email out the times again.
I might give you a promise not to test it.
I was going to see if Deputy Mayor Whalen could join me doing blood.
Mad cow. I can't
Maybe,
give.
maybe the city manager.
You can?
No, I'm verboten because of my residence in Germany in the 80s.
Really?
I aged out.
You had too much of it?
It's longer.
Still mad.
Mad cow shroud.
You see, I couldn't give.
I got my gallon
back.
certificate.
Yeah, I think I'm okay again.
I think I am too.
Well, come Thursday afternoon.
Malaria zone in
Take care.
Africa. Been traveling around.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Keep up the bike patrols. Those are great.
Thank you.
Guys, the bike patrols,
Yeah, the
people
call
like that.
girls and
Yeah,
shit.
yeah. Well done. Mad cow.
We are falling apart.
Mr. Buer, rescue us from our own demise.
The mayor.
The 2019 Comprehensive Plan Map and Text Amendments. It is on 16.
This PowerPoint, yeah, I believe it's on page 43. First thing is Tiffany was to give this presentation. She fell ill, and so you have me this evening. And again, this is establishing the docket for the comprehensive plan amendments for the following upcoming year. Okay.
Yeah.
Which button do I use?
Let's look at the map. No, it's all Springbrook and Woodbrook stuff.
I didn't do anything. Okay. Well, I'll move on to the next slide, which is on page 44, which is what the request is, where the council is being asked to provide a docket list of both privately submitted and city-initiated amendments. These amendments are both for map and text changes. Planning Commission has already seen this and made a recommendation to the City Council. There we go. And this slide gives a very brief overview of the schedule for the upcoming year. There are basically 4 parts to this amendment process once the council establishes the list of amendments. The city performs a city-level SEPA review. Then we contact Department of Commerce and let them know that this is what the amendments are. They in turn contact state agencies who then have an opportunity to comment upon our amendments and submit their comments to the city. Thereafter, we have a Planning Commission public hearing, review, and they make recommendations. And then the City Council also conducts a public hearing. They also review the Commission's recommendation, and then they take action in the form of an ordinance. This is the general schedule. We're right now at the top on November 26th, in which case we are reviewing the proposed amendments. We come back on December the 3rd. We're asking the City Council to finalize the amendments via resolution. And then beginning in December through the spring, we conduct what we call substantive review on the list of amendments. And then we hold the hearings with the Planning Commission in June and then off to the City Council for July, August. We are right now attempting to see if we can't consolidate those a little bit better and have the council have the review as early as late June rather than the July, August timeframe. When you go through and make amendments, there is a reference to Lakewood Municipal Code 18A 14215, and it basically says that if the council is going to approve these amendments, you have to make certain findings. First is it's consistent with the comp plan and compatible with surrounding development, will not unduly burden the transportation system or other public services, will not adversely affect public health, safety, and general welfare, that the use is more appropriate than the entire range of permitted uses in the existing zoning classification. And I'll give an example of that here in a few minutes. Circumstances have changed substantially to justify the request, and then any negative impacts of the project are largely outweighed by the advantages to the city and the community in general. Both the Commission and Council will be asked to make these findings, and on more complex projects, the findings can be rather lengthy. Should the Council propose adding items to the docket for 2019, we always add the caveat that we have to go through a threshold determination. We tried to do most amendments using a DNS or determination of non-significance. But if the council proposes amendments that trip that and get us into higher threshold determination where we have to do a supplemental environmental impact, that could possibly cause some delays. I'm just letting you be aware of that as you talk about these proposed changes. This is a copy of your current land use map for the city of Lakewood. And the next series of slides is going to go through and review the map amendments. And after that, we'll follow up with the text amendments. Here's the general location of all of the amendments as of tonight. The areas in red are the map changes. They constitute a total area of about 42 acres citywide, if you take them all up and add them together. 3 of the changes, actually 4 of the changes, are found in Tillicum and Woodbrook, and 1 change in Springbrook, a couple of changes in North Lakewood, and fixing some zoning and land use designations around Wards Lake. This is the mass amendment, CPA-1, and this is located in Tillicum. This is a privately initiated amendment of 3.5 acres. They're wanting to change the comprehensive plan designation and zoning from residential to neighborhood commercial. This is anticipation of the changes in the Berkeley interchange, and there is also some changes that are being proposed on Thorn Lane, but no one has submitted an application for that. That is something that the city would probably come back and look at in future years once the design and construction has been completed for Thorn Lane. And in this particular situation, staff is of the opinion that this application is sort of premature and that you may wish to wait on this if you desire to do so.
Mr. Branstetter.
Yeah, in that vein, and as we go through this and the others, that my understanding is that we're taking action next week where we're going to finalize a list, and that it's, well, you said we can add things to it, we can also take things off.
Yes.
And, so, this particular application is very, very difficult to assess because it's kind of a guessing game as to what would happen when a new interchange is there and how would that affect things. It's a fully built out single family residential area. And quite honestly, Tillicum has underutilized neighborhood business district properties up and down Union Avenue in our plan, comprehensive plan, and other plans are, we're looking to invest in catalyst projects such as a library and eventually a train station, an Amtrak station there perhaps, to build up the neighborhood business district. And adding more of neighborhood business district acreage in Tillicum would dilute the focus of trying to get what has long been the focus of our comprehensive plan to build the neighborhood business, the business district in Tillicum along Union Avenue. And so, I would look to want to not have this particular one considered in this cycle. To be able to go and do that, because I just don't think we're going to have the data to evaluate the criteria by which we're supposed to decide whether something should be approved. But given that it's on your list today, is the process of taking it off, meaning that it will have to come up on the agenda next time and then there be an amendment to take it off? Or could we discuss it today and have a consensus to take it off and then not have it be on the it's a resolution?
It is a resolution. You could come to consensus this evening to pull it, and then we would remove it from the resolution if that's what you do. Then the next piece was we would refund the funds of this individual who paid the money for the application. We'd also tell them that this is not timely at this time, but this amendment may be considered by the city council at a later date, in which case it may also be a city-initiated amendment. But that's to be determined.
Well, I guess I would just ask for other comments as to whether or not you know, I would be in favor of taking it off the list and not putting it on our workload this year of trying to evaluate against that set of criteria that we've got to do it, because we're just not going to have that data. And I just don't see it as right for Tillicum.
Well, what's R3? It's not, I don't think it's right for Tillicum now.
Houses.
It's houses, R3.
Yeah,
Nobody's gonna.
It's a fully developed block of single-family houses.
Well, yeah, a lot of it's undeveloped. It's trees and a bunch of rundown places.
So, Mr. Buer,
nobody's going to build new houses there. So, how do we incentivize development other than upzoning?
So it's one owner?
No, gosh, I'd have to go back and take a look. I believe that they have assembled the property.
Pardon?
I believe they've assembled the properties.
What can they do with NB? There, okay, so, and this is where I always get confused. There's proposed zoning, NC2, neighborhood commercial 2, with proposed future land use, NBD, neighborhood business district. Okay. So what's the difference between proposed zoning and proposed future?
Well, let me back up on this. What you're not seeing is the overlay of the interchange that's going to be on top of this.
Right, okay.
That's going to have a substantial change in the overall outlook. But the final design of what that that intersection is going to look like keeps changing a little bit. And until it's finalized, I'm just really not thinking that it's appropriate to go to any type of commercial zoning right now. NC2 zoning, to answer your specific question, is what you currently see along Union Avenue at this point, which is...
You can have multifamily in NC2.
You can also have multifamily in NC2 at a higher density. And you can have mixed-use development as well. I'm not saying that this is a bad idea. I'm just saying that this is something that you might wish to consider at a later date once you have more information. And do it at the same... Yes, and do it at the same time you're looking at Thorn Lane.
And then, okay. So what you're saying is once the design is finalized, the owner certainly can come back, owners can certainly come back and ask again, or we could do a city-initiated amendment.
Mr. Mayor, you want me to continue to move forward?
Go forward.
The next one is by Nielsen Corporation. They own the large brick-making plant located south of Walmart. On this top of the map, you see CPA2. That's the southerly terminus of the Walmart site. Those are currently 2 lots. They are proposing to change the zoning from I2 to C2, and then the comprehensive plan designation from industrial to corridor commercial. That type of zoning is not found along this section anywhere on Bridgeport Way, but is found on Pack Highway. A more appropriate zoning in this area may be NC2 and not CC. And that's something that we will do the analysis on if this application moves forward.
What does C2, CC do?
It allows for a higher intensity of commercial uses, no housing, and you get into service commercial uses, repair garages, car lots and things of that nature, which I do not believe, if you drive down Pack Highway south of Bridgeport Way to Gravity Lake Drive, you have a variety of different semi-industrial uses. That's where you have Kenworth, for example. This is probably not that type of zoning, but if you are interested in commercial, the NC2 would probably be a more appropriate zoning. But that's where we get back into these findings. What is the zoning in relationship to the proposal? Is it better or worse? But that's something we'll look at in a future date, but this is what their application is. The next one is by Phoenix Capital. This is 6 parcels. This is located in the Woodbrook neighborhood on 146th Street. To the south of 146th Street, you already have industrial, an industrial business park. They are proposing to take the 12 acres and expand it with an additional industrial warehouse. They've already submitted their applications for the industrial development. This site is highly underutilized, has very few units on the property.
No, it makes some sense. It's not the same zoning that's across the street.
Yes.
And the line on top is the McCord boundary?
Yes, to the north side is McCord Residences. And then those little dots that you see on the right, those are mobile home units in an existing mobile home park. This is the Clover Park School District property that's currently zoned PI. This is a small piece of property, 2 acres. This is a part of a land acquisition with a prospective buyer. They're desiring to change this from public institutional to industrial business park as a part of a project, future project development to change the development, remove the Woodbrook Middle School and place a 700,000 square foot industrial warehouse facility. Okay, and then in between, on 146th to 150th, this is a staff recommendation to also change the zoning on these pieces of property to industrial and industrial business park as well. You have a variety of different uses on these properties. You have a facility that repairs vehicles. You have some individual mobile home units. You have manufactured housing. At the north end, you have some apartment complexes. If you do change the zoning on this to IBP, those all become legal non-conforming uses. And this is basically another staff recommendation, and this came from me. This is trying to clean up the zoning pattern adjacent towards the lake. This is a housekeeping item, but it drives me nuts that we have all these different zones, and some of the zones are on top of existing lakes. Part of it's an AC2. We're trying to change all this and make it more consistent. So that's what this is about. I'm not anticipating this to be a very complicated amendment. Again, this is a housekeeping one. Okay, this is going back to the Nielsen property, and again to the northwest is Walmart, and there's this tiny little piece of property that's zoned multifamily. This area used to be zoned high density multifamily at one time. And throughout the years, we made changes to the multifamily, but somehow, for whatever reasons, we ended up with this leftover parcel. It's about 29,000 square feet, and we're proposing to change the zoning and the comprehensive plan designation to match the existing uses that surround it, which is industrial. Again, this is a very simple change. Moving down into Springbrook, these are 3 parcels. The city's in the process of acquiring ownership of these 3 residential properties, and the desire is then to, once acquisition's been obtained, that this would all be zoned open space, and then we expand the park. Again, I believe this is a very simple and straightforward request, but this is just an effort to kind of keep our map up to date with current events. There are a series of staff recommended text amendments, and the language is pending. The reason why the language is pending is since these are something that the council hasn't seen yet, we're not sure exactly if you're interested in it or not, so we try to keep it simple. But Amendment 10 would amend 18A 3700 and other sections of the Lakewood Municipal Code. And I want to also add, we also want to review our comprehensive plan policies to make sure that what we're proposing and what we're doing is consistent with the 2015 ACU's report for McCord Field. For the most part, this is cleanup. There will also be some changes that come from the update to Title 18A as well. Number 11 has to do with changing or looking at our public institutional zoning district and other sections of the code, as well as the comprehensive plan, to address the use of buildings in the PI zoning district. And I'll go back to that in a minute if you just give me a moment. Number 12 is amending the Comprehensive Plan Economic Development Update to update it with recent population and employment statistics and recent actions, for example, the Downtown Sub-Area Plan. Here we're looking at some map changes, most likely in AC1 and in the North Clear Zone. There are some properties that the boundary bifurcates properties. We want to fix that. We also want to take a look at the land use patterns in the North Clear Zone and true those up with the current ACU's report. Okay, this map shows you all the public institutional zones in the city. And our current code basically says if you're over 10 acres in size, you need to have a master plan. We have master plans for Clover Park School. We have master plans for the Clover Park Technical College. We have one for Pierce Transit. We have a third one for the hospital. We have one for one of the high schools, one for the middle school, Hutloff. And we have an outdated one for Western State Hospital. We want to go back and make sure that the language in the comp plan as well as in the text is descriptive of the type of activities that are currently going on. We also want to address non-conforming uses within the PI zoning district. So that's what that change is about. It's not specific to a specific piece of property, but it is in relationship to the entire PI zone and the PI designation. And so what is being proposed is to bring back to you a resolution at your next council meeting with these amendments.
Mr. Branstad.
I guess I still didn't glean from your remarks what kind of changes in language about the use of buildings we would end up proposing to put into the comp plan. And it's something to change 11. You talked about
there is some concern that in some of the PI zones, we could end up with buildings that are not being used and remain vacant for long periods of time. And if that's the case, the city would like to see a reuse plan or at least have the buildings removed or demolished. There's also some additional language that we would like to contemplate wherein the city of Lakewood, if you have a master plan, specifically indicating that the master plan is only good for a specific number of years and you have to come in and update it.
And that's a change from what? What does it say now?
Pardon me?
What does it say now?
It doesn't really address those specific issues.
And the proposed text isn't drafted yet.
The proposed text has not been drafted, that's correct.
Okay.
It was Mr. Mulkey. There was some discussion from time to time about the excess NC zones in the state or in the city. Was any thought given to staff proposed amendments to downzone some of those?
That's what this is what part of the comprehensive plan amendment process is for 2019 is to take a look at downzoning existing.
Next cycle.
This coming cycle in 2019.
This in addition to these?
Yes.
Changes. Okay, thank you. Mr. Polkey.
Okay, so there's a couple of things that have come up in discussions, I think, prior, and you're asking for council input, and one of the things that we had a discussion about is because we changed the flood maps, we didn't change them, we accepted the new flood maps like we were supposed to do, and it specifically my question or my comment that I think we need to look at that area north of Clover Creek in the Springbrook neighborhood, north of Clover Creek, bounded by Bridgeport, I-5, the JBLM. And because it seems there's that property that's still out there that we have now rezoned industrial. It looks like there's transit-oriented commercial still there. And then there's multifamily all over the place in an area, and even some properties that haven't been built on, there's multifamily, even though they're now in a flood zone or floodplain or whatever the case may be. So it seems to be a hodgepodge, and it's developing as a hodgepodge. It already has some multifamily. There's the kidney dialysis center going in right there at the corner, right by I-5. And I'm assuming the industrial property will become some sort of industrial property. So I think, and we're also planning to invest in a major street improvement in that area. There's also a guy who wants to build, and I guess that's what brought it up, the guy who wants to build a big apartment building in a floodplain. So that's my first thing, I think, is a council that I think we need to look at. I mean, I think we need a comprehensive review of that area.
The TSC, right?
Well, of that triangle between I-5, JBLM, and Clover Creek. That right now it's just a hodgepodge of stuff. What you're going to end up with is the guy's going to build low-income housing on one side, and then somebody's going to build, Lord knows, a warehouse on the other side. And then there's a kidney dialysis place down the street. It just doesn't make any sense at all. And
the interest in the gravel pit property has all been for the purchaser side, has all been for distribution center, warehouse office.
So which brings in a different type of traffic level. So that's the one thing that I think I'd like to look at. And then I don't know that it's a comp plan amendment or what we talked about when we were going through the downtown plan, the open space requirement that apartment buildings were going to have to do. And we discovered that we had like the lowest requirement. And I believe, and I don't know that that's a comp plan amendment or what we have to do, or we just go into 18A and that's something we'll do next year. Because I believe that we had the lowest level, right? That for every apartment, we only needed X number of feet or something. And then the other thing, I still, and I guess that one amendment got dropped, the R2 amendment.
We talked about that with the city manager. That was changing the R2 to R3.
No, the backwards.
Change
that other property. That's not in here tonight.
I'm a little confused.
No, I won't bring it up. There was another property that you said by law had to be R2.
Yeah, oh, that particular one off of Lakeview, after further conversation with the city attorney, that could potentially end up being quasi-judicial.
Oh, okay.
So therefore, it was decided that that was appropriate to remove it from consideration, and that's why the numbering sequence in the resolution is off.
Okay.
We specifically did it that way so that people recognize it was removed.
Okay, so if it's quasi-judicial, we'll just leave it. I do think that at the end of the day, we also, and I don't know if it's comp plan amendment or not, we have to look at the residential dwelling units per acre of R2, that I still don't think it makes any sense. It's a rural level of zoning. I think it's against the law. I think the Growth Management Hearings Board has been more than patient with us and holding on this idea that just neighborhoods, just in places, can have huge lots and not redevelop. So,
may I address your the open space issue? Yeah. Okay, we can make that change either as a part of the 18A update or the comprehensive plan amendment, zone text amendment process. Both of these are sort of dovetailing one another. Comprehensive plans would come first, followed by 18A. Whatever is the easiest, frankly, is where we'll stick it. I hope that's saying it properly, but I know that Tiffany and I have talked about this, and it's not fallen off the agenda. The other one with Springbrook, I'm a little bit frustrated because I think we've probably changed the zoning on this little section 3 or 4 times since I've been here. We've never been able to actually do it justice. And I think the latest issues with the floodplain rules and regulations have caused greater frustration because it's more difficult to develop. I actually received a phone call from one individual who thought that pink area or TOC area in the Springbrook neighborhood ought to be industrial now, but it was too late to submit an application. So that might be the best use for that area, or at least parts of it, but I understand what you're saying. If the rest of the council agrees, we can add it as an amendment. Our density question for the R2, that's a pretty substantial change. That's all I'll say for now. That's fairly significant. And we've attempted once before to change the R2 zoning and met with a tremendous amount of resistance. I'm
not saying change the zoning, I'm saying change the definition.
Yes, definition, okay.
Any further questions? Well, thank you. Mr. Bolke.
What do we want to do with the North Springbrook?
With
North Springbrook one or the one in Tacoma?
No.
North Springbrook?
We need to talk about that.
Well, the floodplain area. I'd like to see a picture of it, since I don't have it in my mind.
But let me do this. I'll include a descriptor as a part of the resolution and some additional maps, and you guys can take a look at it at your December 3rd meeting, and you can either approve or amend the resolution at that time. Staff has no objection to it. I think it's a reasonable request. I just wish that we come to a final conclusion on this little section of Springbrook.
Fewer lines on the map.
Yep.
I think it makes a lot of sense.
I mean, this is one we moved the one property from one, whatever it was before, to TOC to industrial. Right? I mean, just since I've been here, we've moved it. So, and I think, and I've stated this before, I just think it's bad government. It's at the end of the day wrong, and I won't ever really, I try not to say that when you're involved in government, but I believe it's bad government, and it's wrong to allow people to build residential facilities, especially high residential facilities, in floodplains. The science is it's a floodplain because it floods. And if you know, and you actually encourage people to live there, it's really on us. It's not on the people who build there. It's on the governments that allow them. Because when it happens, people are going to say, now why were they even allowed to be there? Well, because the local government thought it was a good idea, right? Okay. So, I mean, that's what I think. The day it became a floodplain, we should have immediately froze everything in there.
Get a loan too, which is a challenge.
They can't. I always harken back to my country cousins who may not have been most sophisticated, but knew that you built a house upwind from the barn and uphill from the creek. Zoning's simple.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Caulfield, reports by the city manager. You guys gonna make it back?
Good evening, Mayor and Council. Just some updates for you. As a follow-up to the Council's adoption of the budget last week, we did send out letters to all the signatories of the 2004 cooperative ILA that was signed. In addition, the next day on Tuesday, we did have a scheduled meeting with the members of Metro SWAT that have resources in Metro SWAT, and so we were able to communicate to them the council's direction on that. One of the questions they had was does that also include the major crime unit, the traffic investigations team, and the civil disturbance team, and we says no, it only refers to the Metro SWAT. So we did use that time to have a conversation about the best way to address that. And so what we all agreed was actually based on what our recommendation is, which would be to develop 2 ILAs. One that would focus on major crimes and traffic investigations. And the reason putting those together, those are post-incident type investigations. And so really the risk there is relatively low. There's always risk, but it's relatively low. And then to have a second ILA that would focus specifically on the civil disturbance team. And the reason there is because that's actually probably a high-risk type element that we want to try and get our hands around. So we're in the process of developing those. I would anticipate probably coming back to you in the early part of 2019 with some more information on that. Also, if Chief Zaro didn't mention it this evening, one of the things that we do want to report back to you, hopefully by December 10th, is just kind of the strategy, an outline and a timeline about how we are going to stand up the high-risk warrant team, and then hopefully we'll be able to enter into a contract with the Sheriff's Office. I would ask the Mayor and the Council maybe to keep an open mind on the other option that we had, which was the Special Tactical Team. It's very, very similar to a high-risk warrant team, with the caveat that a special tactical team, which would just be Lakewood-oriented, would also allow us to do some things like hostage rescue and some of those kind of more toward the SWAT emphasis as well. So probably more to come on that. And I think if you recall, that was option 6A. So just wanted to just give you a heads up on that. On the adult family home business side, our communications manager put on her old journalist hat and developed a timeline of kind of how we got to where we are with adult family home businesses in Lakewood. And actually, we went back to the projected release of our good friend Butterfield there about a year ago, actually over a year ago now. And so if she hasn't already posted on that on our website, it will be in the next day or two. And then she's also going to submit it to the Suburban Times to try and get it out there in the community. And I'm sure she'll use social media to get the word out on that as well. An item I'm bringing forward to you this evening, and I just need some consensus on this, Mayor, is we did receive a request to rename Motor Ave in recognition of Dr. Claudia Thomas. The resolution that you have regarding that process stipulates that there shall be a lapse of at least 36 months before that type of a process can be initiated. However, your policy also says, or at the discretion of the City Council. So you have 2 options. One is to wait the 36 months. The second option is to initiate that review process sooner rather than later. If you would like to choose the latter option, my recommendation would be to process that through the Parks Recreation Advisory Board as part of their 2019 work plan.
I think what we did with requests with respect to late Chief Larry Saunders was to abide by our policy.
That's correct. And your policy, again, is 36 months, but you also have discretion to not abide by the 36 months. So.
And I've also heard some concerns that that might not be the most appropriate way to honor Claudia, in that her emphasis was always on youth and had very little emphasis on infrastructure. So that if we were to name something after her, it logically should be youth-oriented.
And Mayor, you could provide direction to, for example, if you use the PRAB as the facilitating agent on this, to look at other areas and options and bring that back to the council.
Is that a possibility? Yeah. This man.
You also have a new school that's coming up.
Yeah. Mr. Brandstetter.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think it's a good idea to rush to do this in advance faster than our policy would allow, or even to just sort of rush to just say yes or no to the first suggestion that gets put forward. I think, you know, I think the timelines of our policy really allow for us to do some due consideration with perhaps there being something appropriate that would emerge during 2021 in our 25th anniversary that would be in a really good appropriate time to also be considering the contributions of the founders of our city, and particularly Dr. Thomas, to do that. I also would be in favor of whenever we want to start the process of evaluating possibilities, that we really would, rather than just assign it in the work plan of the Parks and Recreation Board or someone, that we actually put together an ad hoc committee of some folks who actually knew Dr. Thomas, had some insights as to who she was and what she was involved with, being able to go and do that, so that it is not just a group that's doing that, but it is people who really can take that to heart. And so, but I think we can do that at some point in time in 2019, of convene an ad hoc group that would meet during 2020 or so, and then if we came up with something that was appropriate, incorporate that into our 2021 25th anniversary list of events, of things that we're going to do. That would really be my preference.
Any other thoughts? I'm fine with that. Defer. Yeah, it looks like you have a consensus to defer.
And something this body might want to think about is actually refining your policy and taking out the language "or at the discretion of the city council." Because every time this is going to come up, I'm just going to be upfront with it. Every time this is going to come up, I'm going to be in front of you saying, okay, 36 months, but you also have discretion. Yeah. So.
It's good to have discretion. You always have discretion to.
You always have discretion, even if it's not in writing. That's right. That's right. So, on the economic development front, if you have a chance, Becky Newton has updated our economic indicators report. And it's been posted to the city's website. She's also in the process of updating our economic development brochure, so you can look for that in the next few days, or at least the next week. I think, as you might have heard this evening, had some issues at the New World VIP Lounge, and we have denied their business license, and so we don't expect them to reopen. We're waiting on the appeal period to expire, which, if I recall, was at the end of last week, but we'll see what happens there. But at this point in time, they are not allowed to reopen. You had Mr. Buer here this evening. One of the major code initiatives in 2019 that CED will be taking on, of course, is the 2019 comprehensive plan amendments and the associated zoning code amendments. There's a couple of other items that are making their way through, or will be making their way through, the Planning Commission, and then coming forward here to you is the quasi-judicial zoning text amendments that we talked about a month ago, the sign code, the shoreline master plan, which is a mandate from the state, and then, of course, Title 18A update. So 2019 will be very, very busy when it comes to issues of land use. The Panettone development, which just opened earlier this year, has been sold. It's been sold to a holding company headquartered out of actually Boston, Mass. They've also mentioned to our staff that once the development that is built on the school district property over the next few years, they might have an interest in buying that as well. So they're very high on the investment opportunities here, not just in Lakewood, but in the Puget Sound region.
Big right now.
Something that we've also had is we've just had some very preliminary conversations with the Nisqually tribe. about them undertaking, you know, just a very basic feasibility analysis about maybe opening a small grocery store in the Springbrook neighborhood. I think we all know that that's a bit of a grocery desert there. And one of the things that really intrigues them is all the activity around Springbrook Park. So they're thinking if they can find a location in close proximity to that. No promises, but again, just based on some very early and preliminary conversations we've had with them, and we'll see what where that will go. A couple more DSHS issues at Western State Hospital. We learned on November 14th that DSHS had submitted a SEPA DNS to expand their Child Study and Treatment Center that's located on Western State Hospital campus right on Silicon Boulevard there. Not part of Western State Hospital, but on the campus. So not operated by Western State Hospital, but operated by DSHS. Their proposal is to construct a 17,000 square foot facility to provide 18-bed treatment facility for children needing psychiatric care. There's two problems. One, we do not believe that it is consistent or in line with their facility master plan. And then secondly, they have determined that they are acting as the lead agency in submitting the DNS, and our code does not allow that. Actually, our code specifically states that any type of activity in a public institutional zone, the city shall be the lead agency. So they got two items working against them there. And so
they still have two open beds?
I don't, oh, yeah. Yes, they do. Actually, three.
Three, yeah.
But in any event, our position is not allowed.
Got it. And before you get to the next one, turn your mic off just for a second. I'm going to compare the sound when you talk just a little bit. Yeah. Can you hear me now? I can hear you great. And this thing is such a weird boxy echo.
Yes.
It's really challenging to actually hear. It's harder for me to hear you next to me when you got that on, and you're...
I don't know about Mike. Try with the hearing aid.
Yeah. I might stand back there. I'm just experimenting. So go ahead and do the rest of your thing without the thing on.
Where on that? I mean, when you talk about the child treatment center, it's up towards Fort Silicon. Are they thinking about moving more towards the neighborhood, or?
No, it's just an add-on to the existing facilities, our understanding.
Okay. Yeah. There was something else mentioned too in one of your emails.
It's down at the corner of 87. Still
okay. And you think it was right in there? And then there was another building I thought you were talking about in there.
So then they have another building called the Oak Ridge Community Facility, and
that's the one that's on 87.
Yes, and so right now they have 16 beds here for young adults, and what we learned in our conversations with DSHS staff in regards to the former issue is that they are looking to house 100 male youth, so define them as male youth. I say they're adults between the ages of 20 and 25. And perhaps there's been some discussion at the DSHS level about housing some of them at Western State Hospital in the Oakwood Community Facility, which would also then allow for an expansion of that. However, our position there is not consistent with your master facility plan. So, but nothing has come about that. That was just information that some of their staff generously communicated to us, and we really appreciate it. So I just wanted to bring that to the council's attention. Also, that would require, I would have to go through the hearing examiners part of the commission. Switching gears, the animal shelter contract, highly unlikely that we'll have a new contract with the Humane Society in place by the end of the year. And so it's kind of a slow go. So Shannon and the county auditor have decided that they're just going to take it on themselves and develop a new contract and work directly with the Humane Society, and then get back with everybody else so we can get this thing done sooner rather than later. In the meantime, we may have to do some kind of an extension of the current contract for maybe first December of 2019. If that's the case, you can expect us to bring that back to you in the early part of January 19.
Coyotes.
You might have remembered mentioning to you that we had submitted a proposal to the UW Evans School of Student Consulting Lab, which is a bunch of grad students that do various projects. And one of the things that we had submitted was to examine and evaluate what the impact of the city's current electoral process is as it relates to the newly established Voter Rights Act. And so the good news is that our project has been submitted. The result of that report will be submitted to me as the city manager. One of the things that Shannon is following up with the team on is if they would be willing to expand that to include other cities as part of the analysis to see how we compare. So we expect that project will kick off in January of 2019.
What's the big issue with the voter rights? Is that the districting issue?
Yeah,
Yes, it is.
it's Yakima.
And I just want to stay out ahead of that in case that becomes an issue here in Lakewood, that's all.
Got it.
Just want to stay out ahead of it.
We're not precipitating it becoming an issue by studying and publishing it.
That's why he's trying to include other cities.
So just want to stay out ahead of it.
Yeah.
You might have seen Bryn Grimley was checking our social media accounts and got some pretty tremendous outreach. The tree lighting event had a reach of over 115,000 people.
Wow.
The parade, almost 240,000.
When you say reach, does that mean people responding to it?
No, total reach, no, but so how it's people touching.
Impressions, yeah.
Huh.
240,000.
Wow.
See, people love parades.
They do, I know.
The Jingle Bell Run had a total reach of about 45,000.
People don't like to run.
I have to register for that.
And then the storefront decorating, which we started last week, had a total reach of a little under 1,000, which is all very, very positive. But again, just the power of social media. And then just wanted to mention a couple of calendaring items. Of course, this Wednesday we're having our dinner event with the 2-2. They will be wearing their dress blues. So it's more on the formal side.
Trying to amortize them before they have to put them away.
Which event, like this Wednesday night?
Yes.
Dress blues?
Not for you.
Oh. Isn't that our dinner thing?
The colonel asked me, he says, I get the impression that they wanted to get dressed up.
Wait a second, this is for the dinner thing that we're
Yes.
supposed to go to.
You are going to.
That means we gotta dress up.
He's got to wear a suit.
They'll wear a suit.
Tux, if they're wearing
No.
dress blues.
No, they're not best dressed.
None of us here are going to be fitted to our dress blues.
No.
Well,
Maybe you.
yeah, I can.
Oh, man, I'll tell you.
Aside from the size, my dress blues are black.
So attire is.
Never
suit,
figured that
John?
out.
Suit, okay.
What? Navy's dress blues are black. I never figured that out. Not Navy. No. Coast Guards are blue. Navy's are black.
I always thought navy was a color.
The white shirts go with the.
You know, I can hear
With
you
the
better
tropical
with that
whites.
thing off.
Yeah. You know, it's,
It was really hard to hear. Yeah.
when Mr. Rogoff was speaking, I had a very hard time
Exactly.
understanding what he was saying. And then
It's a weird thing. It's almost like if we had a monitor almost up front projecting here as opposed to this
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah, he's,
that's why I suggested a sound engineer.
Yeah.
Sound laterally instead of
Like when you're-
vertically.
now,
Yeah, like when you're in
you
choir,
mentioned
you
it
got a
was hard
monitor
to
up front.
understand Mike. I can understand real well, but it's probably because of proximity to him.
I can hear him better now that his mic's on.
It's-
Yeah, I can hear it.
Has anybody ever been to a concert where the speakers were on the ceiling pointed down?
No,
Point taken.
end of discussion.
It's a weird echo chamber.
Council comments. Ms. Moss, Mr. Volkey, Mr. Brandstetter, Ms. Barth,
Oh, good.
Mr.
Yes, sir.
Leadoff.
We,
I did have
That's out of his 72 or whatever they, okay.
37,000 maybe.
Yeah, it might be, sounds like half, yeah, that's good. Oh, he's been. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And it's nothing that I have to report on. It's just simply that I have a question and I'm looking for some advice. I have mentioned this, yeah, imagine that. I've mentioned this body once or twice that sitting at PCRC meetings can border on, oh, shall we say, boredom. And the feeling, yeah, and the feeling that that nothing gets done. And I've been rolling around this idea, and this is where your wisdom is required. Is it within our purview, and that would be specifically Paul and Jason, and I suppose in a sense me, to suggest that PCRC change the way it does business? And here's my rationale. We meet every other week in a study session like we have tonight. Then the following week, we do the work of the city. We pass ordinances or resolutions. And it seems to me that the few PCRC meetings I've attended, things are dropped on people.
Totally.
And my suggestion would be every other month, PCRC has a study session. The following month, PCRC goes about make the action items. And the reason I started thinking this was, remember the councilwoman from Tacoma talking about the TCC and the whole changing of the representation? She made it very clear. She wasn't comfortable with that because they got dropped on her. And I started thinking, if this is a regional council, then shouldn't it be acting more like, and I will use us as an example, a city council like Lakewood, which has a study session before it acts, not dumping everything on you, and in the next 74 minutes, we are going to pass this. So I'm wondering, are we as members of that council allowed to bring forth this proposal in how they conduct their business?
So it's probably within the bylaws as opposed to interlocal. Isn't there an interlocal that generally governs it?
I don't know what their rules are, because, but I agree with what you're saying.
Thank you.
I would say that the item that Tacoma was hacked off about was clearly not an action item, and it was announced that it was not an action item. That there's a little bit of crocodile, it's just a little bit of like,
and I understood.
Oh, we
yeah,
didn't know.
I understood
that. This is just thrust upon us. No, it was a discussion item.
Their staff was involved in it.
And their staff, and they
Yes.
Ian knew enough to be there to berate everybody.
Exactly.
That population wasn't population.
But the point is, if it's a regional council, then I think it should act like a regional council. Otherwise, I begin to question why we are there in the first place.
Well,
I agree they need to make a change.
Yeah.
Jason, what do you think?
I would be fine with that. I think those meetings are designed for us to come fully briefed by our staff on the substantive issues so that we're able to make an informed decision as opposed to kind of a study session for us to get the first wind of it. And we're getting better at that now. We didn't used to have that as staff as we do now, so we're going to be better at that.
We're surprised too. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that was brought up several weeks ago when we asked if Tiffany could get us information faster. And I've heard people say something about that in that meeting. But it also gets to what the gentleman from the University of Washington, Tacoma, was saying. I think he has a good point as far as the demographics go, that we need to be thinking in that regional sense. Pierce County, and there's that word that starts with an R, regional council is where a lot of that thinking should be amplified by the representatives of the 23 cities that sit on that council. Well then, how do you do that? You sit down and you do your homework. And that means every other month is a dedicated, whether it's 60 minutes or 180 minutes or more tonight, then we do our homework. Otherwise, what's the point? PSRC is going to run right over us. That's what I'm really getting at.
Get trained.
I'd have no problem digging into it and looking that up.
All right.
See what we can do.
Thank you. That's
Sounds
all,
like a good idea to me.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Whalen?
I just wanted to say I attended Thanksgiving this last week.
Well, did you watch it?
I was thankful for all of you as I sat down and ate myself silly. So thank you, all of you, for yet another decent holiday season. And that is all I have to say. So I look forward to seeing you this week on Wednesday night.
What time?
6.
5, I thought it said 5:30. I thought it said 5:30 on the calendar. Am I wrong, Mr. City Manager? The way he's looking at me.
So,
I've got 6 p.m. But if we're missing that strengthening our voice at PSRC
Yes.
thing, is that going to be a problem for Dan Meyer?
no.
You're assistant staff, okay.
So I too was thankful for being on a stable council with reasonable people, and speaking of reasonable councils, moving to the antonym, Seattle. I'm going to send you all a very well-written piece on homelessness, particularly aimed at Seattle by a gentleman named Chris Rufo, who you may have heard of in the news. He's a candidate with a suspended campaign for Seattle City Council after his family was rather viciously harassed because of his viewpoints that things needed to change in Seattle. And he's really he's a filmmaker by trade. His wife works at Microsoft. He has done documentaries on poverty in different cities. He's self-described social liberal, fiscal conservative. He's, by accounts of 2 people who know him that I've talked to, reasonable, which means he's ill-suited for political life in Seattle. But on homelessness, he uses titles for the problem, I would call them the problem constituencies, to I guess, create a reaction, but read through them. He attributes the lack of progress after $1 billion to 4 groups. Four groups. The socialist revolutionaries, think Commerçant, we want to take from the bourgeois folks and give things to people. We want everybody to have a house, everybody to have a base income, everybody to have everything, and we're going to kill the billionaires. The second, what he calls the compassion brigades, and those are folks who see, groups who see everyone as a victim, everyone as wanting to work, everyone as a smiling couple with 2 children who's just been in temporary, has temporary financial problems. The third is and I think, because I've run into this in my day job a few times, the homeless industrial complex. And he describes some of the workings. And without naming a name, I'll tell you one of the, and here it's where things have shifted from people being charities who provided services as in a charitable endeavor to businesses that, while they're nonprofits, chase grants and lobby for grants. And there's one well-known that a lot of county money goes to, among other things, that in Western Washington has, not mentioned in his article, but I've verified, has $150 million a year enterprise with over 4,000 employees, and nearly 90% of the money that comes in is from government.
Just one enterprise?
One Catholic Community Services. It's not a Catholic charity. It's a business operating on behalf of government. But
And they pay good salaries.
they have at least yeah, they have a lot of people that make a lot of money. And that's, you know, where other people's money goes. And then the last one he calls the addiction evangelists. These are decriminalize all drug use, needle exchange, free injection sites, and then the myths that go with it. All these are local people, when it's been shown that other areas which have different policies have fewer people coming in than Seattle does. Just things we can watch out for. His suggestions are things like you need housing. It should be, you can have cheap barracks-like housing so that people, and enforce no camping, so that you don't tolerate the society crimes. Co-locate recovery services instead of dispersing them everywhere. So you focus them at the sites. Make work jobs, the value of work. And one of the probably more controversial ones, but I've always thought is important, and we see it here in Lakewood, reform with respect to institutionalization of those who are the most dangerous to themselves and others, instead of turning people who are obviously mentally or chemically deranged out on the streets. So it's well written. It isn't academic. It's well researched. It's footnoted, and it's thought provoking with respect to things you might want to avoid becoming the next Seattle. So we don't have a chance to discuss these things as a group outside, so I apologize for the 5 minutes this late, but that's my story. I'm sticking to it, and I'll forward it through the city manager so you all have an opportunity to see that.
It's not academic. I might be able to read it.
Yeah, it's by a filmmaker. He knows how a storyboard works. Anything further come before the council? And we're adjourned.
I think Heidi wanted to do an executive session for an hour. Did you want to do an executive session for an hour?
Or we could talk about how.
Yeah, exactly.
We'll talk about how our public defenders can survive on such a skimpy contract.
How much were they trying to figure out how many lawyers are involved in that? If there's only 2, that's a pretty damn good contract. But if there's 5 or 6.
No, but they got bills to pay.
Yeah.
For what? Okay.
This time on the van.
Okay.
Dying on it.
When? Here when? December 3rd. That's my half birthday. It's only important when you turn 59 and a half.
So Julie Anderson did get back to me. It can be a week evening. It's an ALF function. She's trying to move it to the south side and have it in Lakewood. But she wants to know if they'll pay for whatever cleaning, but they always have some sort of wine and hors d'oeuvres. Can you even do that here? Outside there? You can't do it in here. Can you do it out there? I'll coordinate with that. I just didn't know if it was a rule that we can't do it in there. Okay. Not in here, but out there. She said that she'll do that. Yeah. Okay. Very good.
Okay, come. I'm going to wipe that.
Yeah.